Прийшли окупанти до нас в Україну, форма новенька, воєнні машини та трохи поплавився їх інвентар. Байрактар, Байрактар. Російські танкісти сховались в кущі, щоб лаптем посьорбати довбані щі, та трохи у чах перегрівся навар. Байрактар, Байрактар. Приперли зі сходу до нас барани для восстановлення
великої страни.
Найкращий пастух баранячих отар. Байрактар, Байрактар. Ті, хто води всяке озброєння, різне, потужні ракети, машини залізні, у нас на всі доводи є коментар. Байрактар, Байрактар. Вони захопити хотіли нас зразу, а ми зачаїли на ордів образу з російських бандитів, робить примар. Байрактар, Байрактар. Російська поліція справи заводить, там вбивцю рашистів ніяк не знаходить, хто винен, що в нашому полі глухар. Байрактар, Байрактар. Веде пропаганду кремлівський урод, слова пропаганди ковтає народ, тепер нове слово знає цар.
Байрактар.
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 Yes.
The Leaf Spring Army sends its regards.
Hello, everyone. I'm the Enforcer, and I'm accompanied by Enforcer Matt.
And good evening, folks. It's Enforcer Matt, and welcome back to day 830 of the news. And it's good to see you all once again on the best night of the week. It is fundraiser night, and also Belarus is getting a little bit frisky out here with the nuclear weapons again. And once again, it's good to see you all.
And of course, we're going to be covering the past 24 hours of the news of the war in Ukraine, as we've gotten massive news while Al Rose is throwing in a massive donation of $100 to the fundraiser, getting us on up there into the area of around $527 on the fundraiser. Absolutely incredible. Al Rose coming in, killing it. Channel legend. We were also able to see that in the area of Belarus, speaking of the top stories of the day, that the Belarusian armed forces have stated that they are in fact nuclear ready, in possession of nuclear weapons in violation of multiple nuclear non-proliferation treaties, and that they will be able in the future to conduct precise tactical nuclear strikes on targets either inside the state of Ukraine, the Republic of Poland, or other Baltic nations further north of Belarus. We have also been able to hear that the city of Kaliningrad is suffering some kind of a humanitarian crisis, as we have seen notably large areas of floodplains being created within the city, and it appears that the Russian Federation may have a humanitarian crisis that it's going to have to address within the area. Not only that, but we've also been able to get the news from the front lines of Ukraine, showing that Ukrainian forces are conducting counteroffensives currently in the Vovchansk area and are still continuing to inflict high casualties on Russian forces and push them back. We have also been able to get one video today in the area around Lukashenko, proving that Ukrainian forces are in fact moving further towards the border area, and Russian forces are being overrun by the Ukrainian advance in this area at this point. Not only that, but we also got a large amount of news from the areas around Bakhmut and Avdiivka, and we also got some very rare and very interesting battlefield footage. And speaking of rare, Andy L threw in an absolutely rare donation of $100, throwing the fundraiser on up to a whopping $677. Unbelievable. But not only that, all of the news today is absolutely unbelievable. But before we get into it, I've got to put out our obligatory statement that tonight is a Sunday night fundraiser, and the fundraiser is for none other than Nova Ukraine. Nova Ukraine is a brand new nonprofit that we have picked up very recently, and this is, I believe, the second time that we've run Nova Ukraine on this channel. Nova Ukraine is an amazing nonprofit that's been helping out in Ukraine for an incredibly long time, over many years, and not only that, they have provided every single thing that you can imagine under the sun. Medical equipment for Ukrainian armed forces, medical equipment for hospitals. They've also provided food, shelter, and many other kinds of services that are absolutely incredible. If you want to know more about Nova Ukraine, type it in on Google, and you'll be able to find their website and look at every single thing and project that they have done so far. But it is truly...
It's tremendous. Like, Nova Ukraine is my new favorite fundraiser to raise money for, because they're doing such good work literally directly on the ground in Ukraine, getting the medical aid and also helping out on so many other fronts as well. Nova Ukraine is an excellent fundraiser to support. And last time we raised a ton of money for them. I can't remember the exact number, but it was a ton. And I'm sure we'll do the same thing tonight.
And I know one thing. We have a $3,000 goal, and the Lee Spring Army has never missed a goal. If you would like to help out in the Ukrainian war effort and help them achieve their way to victory with your help, make sure to support Nova Ukraine tonight, because that nonprofit is doing a bunch of incredible work in the rear lines behind the Ukrainian battlefields, making sure that Ukraine will be able to raise their flag over their lands another day and say that Ukraine will not yet be lost and that no one will be able to take Ukraine from the Ukrainian people. But moving on from that, and on into the major breaking news that we have tonight, we were able to hear that within the city of Minsk, an official statement has come out today from the Belarusian government and the armed forces of Belarus, saying that they are in fact in possession, and I want to say this, in possession of tactical nuclear weapons, and that the Air Force is fully prepared to use tactical nuclear weapons if ordered. Pictured here, I believe, are some Belarusian Su-33s, from what we can tell. And this is something that is very concerning, incredibly concerning as a matter of fact. Not for the fact that they are saying that they are able to use nuclear weapons. That's nothing new. These kinds of aircraft, the Su-33, were always able to carry some sort of a tactical nuclear bomb, a gravity bomb, to the front lines and drop it. So really, Belarus has technically been nuclear capable for a while. However, the statement that they are fully prepared to use tactical nuclear weapons if ordered is something brand new. And this is something that we've never even heard before from the Belarusian end. Many of y'all will know that Russian forces, according to our information, Federation moved nuclear weapons into Belarus, but up until now, we have believed, and the Western world had believed, that those nuclear weapons were under the command of the Russian rocket forces, or the Russian army's rocket forces, meaning that it was still under the jurisdiction, the weapons usage was, of the Russian Federation, and for that reason, we had a fairly good idea of the predictability of those weapons being used, which is fairly low. This, however, changes things, as the Belarusians are now clearly stating, as of right now, they are in possession of the nuclear weapons, and that their armed forces, specifically the Belarusian Air Force, can actually use those nuclear weapons that have been provided to them by the Russian Federation. This is in strict violation of the nuclear non-proliferation treaties that every major nuclear power has become a member of. These members include the United States, France, the United Kingdom, Russia, China, and South Africa. South Africa, by the way, did have nuclear weapons at the time, but in the 90s they disarmed themselves. I think they had approximately 50 nuclear warheads, but that's beside the point. Beyond that, however, also India and Pakistan, by the way, not to leave them out, are also members of the non-proliferation treaties. And the non-proliferation treaties specifically lay out that these countries, all of these countries that are nuclear armed, that signed this treaty, would make sure not to help or facilitate other nations in developing nuclear weapons or any kind of weapons of a nuclear origin. And also, they would not provide nuclear weapons to other countries because of some sort of diplomatic or foreign policy reasons. The Russians and the Belarusians are both now in complete, really, a violation of the nuclear non-proliferation treaties. It was not in violation, I want to make this quite clear, it wasn't in violation for the Russians to move their nuclear weapons into Belarus. Anyone can do that. The United States does that on our own end. We move nuclear weapons in and out of Germany pretty regularly to have a nuclear deterrent inside of Europe. However, handing over these nuclear weapons to the jurisdiction of another nation, like the Russians handing over in this instance, tactical nuclear weapons from their control over to the Belarusians, is a violation of the treaty on the Russians' end, and it's also a violation for the Belarusians to have these nuclear weapons at the moment. This is going to be a massive escalatory move because now we have another layer of unpredictability that has been added in the area of Eastern Europe that we can't really account for as easily as we did when the monolithic nuclear force was just the Russians. Now we have to consider what the Belarusians might do with the tactical nuclear weapons that they have. We don't know what could happen, and we also don't know how unstable the Belarusian government really is. Over the course of the war, we have gotten indications that the Belarusians have a fairly unstable government, and the loyalty of the Belarusian armed forces is questionable at times. It's even been stated, and largely believed over the course of the war, that the reason why the Belarusian armed forces did not partake in the war in Ukraine was because there was a general mutiny against the central government's orders to join in the war, and for that reason, Belarus has never, and probably will never, enter the war in Ukraine. So going off of all of this, it is very, very concerning that the Belarusians are now claiming that they have direct access and control of nuclear weapons. This actually happened overnight.
That's just wild to me. It's wild because it's like, you know, like you mentioned, Belarus has been somewhat on the fence in the past about whether or not they fully support Russia's efforts inside of Ukraine, because Belarus allowed their territory to be used as a staging point for Russian troops in the past. But like you said, Belarus has not directly gotten involved themselves on purpose because Lukashenko doesn't want to get involved. But at the same time, why would Putin hand over control of the nukes from his hands over to Lukashenko, not knowing if his loyalties truly lie with Russia? That seems a bit risky. I understand that that puts the weapons closer to the West, so that's going to intimidate NATO a little bit more, at least in theory, but that seems like a pretty big risk by Putin.
I would say that this is an incredibly big risk, not just by Putin, but also by the Belarusians as well. What in the world can happen? I mean, like, there's a lot that can happen. Belarus could actually become, and a lot of people have always joked that Belarus is the North Korea of Europe because of the dictatorship that controls Belarus, and also how not really a lot of information comes in and out of Belarus, to be entirely honest. Now it is actually legitimately possible. They could actually just become a North Korea of Europe. They're nuclear armed. At this point, even if their nuclear weapons are incredibly short in range and they're gravity bombs of a tactical nuclear size, that means that we will not risk touching them, because we would be putting NATO nations such as the Baltic states and Poland at considerable risk of nuclear strikes if we were to do anything to try and disarm the Belarusians. So going off of that, this is something that's incredibly severe. And also on top of that, like Matthew was saying, what in the world did the Russians do to get them back? I mean, the Belarusians don't even have to give these back to the Russians, because the Russians could say, okay, give them back over. And the Belarusians could go, no. And then what are the Russians going to do? Risk going to war with Belarus and having tactical nuclear weapons dropped on the already wildly weakened Russian army and end up wiping out even more combat readiness out of the Russian armed forces? Highly unlikely that the Russians would do that either, meaning that Belarus could end up just being locked in place the way it is right now, and there's really nothing anyone could do. And also on top of that, they have nuclear weapons. So if the government becomes incredibly fragile, or it starts to become incredibly unstable, who knows what could happen from that point forward. But that one...
It could be a lie. It could be a lie because, when you really think about it, it makes no sense. Like if Putin were to actually hand over the weapons to Belarus, that makes no sense whatsoever. And even though Putin is a killer, he's a very lethal dictator. He's not really stupid at the same time. So it's like, I'd really have doubts he would actually do that. So I'm wondering if maybe Lukashenko is simply bluffing and they're still in the Russian hands. Although they're stationed in Belarus, the weapons might not actually be under Lukashenko's control, and they're just trying to pull a bluff on NATO.
Maybe that's what they're trying to do, but I don't really know why they would want to do that, because whether the missiles are in, well, not the missiles, but the bombs, whether they're in the control of the Russian armed forces or the Belarusian armed forces, they're still in Belarus. The only thing that this statement has made clear today is that both nations are in violation of non-proliferation treaties, which massively escalates the diplomatic sphere, well, the situation in the diplomatic sphere, and then it will probably make Western nations a lot more hostile, in all honesty, especially the United States, the United Kingdom, and France, considering that all three of those countries are a member of those treaties, and that the Belarusians and the Russians are now in clear violation of such treaties. So, in my opinion, I wouldn't really see why they would want to bluff like that, because it doesn't really change the strategic situation in Eastern Europe. It just changes the diplomatic field to where it's escalated a lot farther, and it's getting closer to a very concerning situation, more so than de-escalating things or keeping things kind of at a norm. And on top of that, it's not even really like there could be a diplomatic concession made off of this by the West to appease the Russians as far as the war is going in Ukraine. To be quite honest, everything I'm seeing, this absolutely makes no sense at all that the Russians would have transferred control of these missiles, and I would, well, control these bombs, and I would assume that they did transfer the control because of what I said a moment ago. It would make no sense to lie about something like that. It doesn't really benefit them. It only causes more tension and even worse issues. So I would have no idea why in the world they said that, but nevertheless, a lot of people have been talking about Belarus saying that it's prepared to use tactical nuclear weapons if Putin gives the order, and a lot of people have been putting out their thoughts. Some people are saying that Belarus may end up just being the sacrifice, pretty much, for the Russian Federation. So that way, if Russia needs to use tactical nuclear weapons, they'll do it through Belarus, and the Russians will not be directly for blame, although they will be because the weapons are Russian in origin. Some people are saying that this is all an attempt just to intimidate NATO and possibly scare us into some sort of a weaker position in the region, or this could possibly backfire and we could start going into a much more hostile position against Russia and Belarus going on into the future. Some other people are saying that it's serious and escalation is needed, meaning that the United States and other nuclear-armed nations within Europe need to start moving their nuclear weapons towards the area of Kaliningrad, Belarus, and the Russian Federation. And then some people are a little bit unsure, but everyone is having an opinion on this, and rightfully so. From what we can tell, this statement today is showing that there has been a massive escalation inside of Europe. And I want to make this quite clear. Right now, nuclear weapons are not flying. I know that usually, and I have to give a little bit of a speech here before we get into what everyone's thinking and all that, but a lot of people on YouTube always use in their thumbnails and titles something about nuclear weapons to draw in views and fearmonger. That's not really the intention of what we're doing tonight on this channel. We did hear the news, and it is confirmed that the Belarusian government did make this statement today, and for that reason, we find it very important to talk about this. You know, of course, not being clickbait, this is an actual story, because this kind of escalation is something that historically has never been seen before. We have never seen a nuclear-armed country provide nuclear weapons to a non-nuclear country. And a lot of people will be thinking, Well, what about Cuba in the Cuban Missile Crisis? Even in that situation, which almost went to an actual conventional conflict and then probably on to nuclear blows, even then, those nuclear missiles stationed in Cuba were controlled by Soviet forces and were not handed over to Cuba for them to operate. We have never seen a situation like this. In fact, even with North Korea, which is a rogue state armed with nuclear weapons, we understand that according to official documents from the People's Republic of China and the former Soviet Union, that North Korea stepped out and asked China and the Soviet Union to either provide them with nuclear weapons or provide them with scientists and assistants to help in the development of a nuclear weapon. And time again, the Soviet Union and the Communist Chinese both denied the requests every single time that the North Koreans gave. And the North Koreans ended up having to develop their own nuclear weapons program and go through all of the development process on their own. So going off of all of that, this is an unprecedented moment in world history to hear a statement where Belarus says they are ready. Now, and they're not saying the Russians are ready on Belarusian territory to use these nuclear weapons. The Belarusians are saying we are ready to fly nuclear weapons provided to us by the Russian Federation to targets either in Ukraine or in Eastern Europe and drop them onto enemy forces when ordered. That's what they're saying. This has never been seen before in world history as far as nuclear weapons and nuclear proliferation is concerned. And so, Matthew, what are people saying about this unbelievable statement that the Belarusians made today? And what are you thinking about it as well?
All right, so on Belarus's statements about them being prepared to use tactical nuclear weapons against the West and Ukraine, simply if Putin gives the order, it looks like 50% said Belarus will be Putin's sacrifice, 35% said Belarus is just intimidating NATO, and 9% said that sounds very serious and escalation is needed by the West to respond to it. And on this one, I would say that I'm going to call the bluff on this one. I don't think that Belarus has those nuclear weapons in their control. It would make no sense whatsoever, and that would really prove Putin to be a fool if he were to hand those weapons over to Belarus to put them in their control. That would make no sense on his part, and I refuse to believe that has been done. I'm sure that nuclear weapons have been actually transferred into Belarus, but they're probably still under Russian control, even though they're on the territory. So if it was actually true that nuclear weapons were transferred and given to Belarus for their control, I would say, honestly, I'd be with the 50%. I would say that Putin is trying to use Belarus as a sacrifice, so hoping that the West would only attack Belarus if nukes were launched. But that would be a stupid move as well, because the West knows that Belarus is an extension of Russia. It's basically West Russia. It's a puppet state. So if Belarus launched a nuke, we would attack not only Belarus, we'd also probably attack Russia as well, because we'd view that as orders directly from the Kremlin. So either way you look at it, it makes no sense. So I'm going to say they're bluffing. But Enforcer, what say you?
It makes no sense, but the problem is that we can't apply, I believe we can't apply a logical framework to this, because the war in Ukraine is illogical in its own right. In from the beginning of the war, it's made no sense why the Russians would undergo that, why they would undergo all of the massive sanctions and the economic crumbling that they're facing right now. That doesn't make any logical sense either. Yet it's something that happens every day in front of our very eyes, and we report on it every single night. And for that reason, while this seems entirely illogical for the Russians to provide tactical nuclear weapons to the Belarusians for them to now use and operate, I would have to believe that that is something that is true. We thought it was highly unlikely that the Russians moved their nuclear weapons into Belarus until video and picture evidence came out about several months later showing that Russian nuclear weapons carrying systems were in Belarus and were actually operational, carrying around nuclear weapons throughout the territory of Belarus. Going off of that, I would assume that this statement by the Belarusian Armed Forces today, which we will be going to again, and I'll go right over here, Belarusian Ministry of Defense. This is a direct statement from the Belarusian Military Defense. The Air Force, meaning the Belarusian Air Force, is fully prepared to use tactical nuclear weapons if ordered. And let me explain why that would mean the Belarusians have jurisdiction over these weapons now instead of the Russians. When we're talking about the United States, tactical nuclear weapons inside of Europe, we have a handful. I believe it's around 3 tactical nuclear weapons that are known of, and they're all B-61 gravity bombs that are stationed inside of Germany. If these tactical nuclear weapons were ever used inside of Europe, they would be loaded onto American aircraft such as the F-35 or the F-15 and flown to their targets in the area of Eastern Europe and dropped onto large cores, or nowadays with the Russian army structure, it would more so be a brigade level unit or well, really a brigade level unit. The battalion would be decimated as a part of the brigade. But beyond that, this is something that makes me believe that for the most part, the Belarusians have to be in control, because when we move our tactical nuclear weapons into Germany, we don't tell the German Air Force, okay, y'all are going to load the tactical nuclear weapons up if we need to use them, and then y'all fly them out to wherever and then drop them on someone. We don't tell the Germans that. We say, we're moving our nuclear weapons into your country. We're going to be in control of them every single step of the way, and we're also going to be using them on our aircraft if they ever have to be used. There is not a single time where we go, okay, y'all take them and go bomb them. And so going off of that statement from the Belarusian Ministry of Defense, this seems to me to state that they have the tactical nuclear weapons. If that is the case, and also, another thing that's interesting, it doesn't really say by Putin, it just says if ordered. That may be by the orders of Lukashenko, for all we know. We don't really know if it's going to be ordered by Putin or if it's going to be ordered by Lukashenko, because this is the only statement we have, and it does not clearly specify who would be ordering that strike. I would assume Lukashenko. This is now showing that Belarus is a nuclear-armed country in Europe. And a lot of people are saying, oh, you know, you're reading too much into this. But there is, I'm not really, I mean, I'm reading the literal words. The Air Force is fully prepared to use tactical nuclear weapons if ordered. And there's only
what would really be the advantage, though, if Putin were to actually hand the weapons over to Lukashenko and say, here's nuclear weapons, you can have them and use them how you want on the West if I order it? What would be the real advantage? Because moving those nuclear weapons from Russia right over to Belarus is really not that big of a difference, like you kind of said earlier. And for Putin to take on that big of a risk, that wouldn't really weigh out like the reward and risk like analysis on that. That wouldn't even weigh out on that front either. So what's the real reason that he'd want to give Belarus those nukes?
Well, one reason he may have given Belarus the nuclear weapons was to make sure that Belarus would be able to remain intact. It's going to be a weapon to make sure not only that Belarus is secure from possible NATO intervention in the future for one form or another, but also it would be making sure that the Belarusian government is going to be a lot more, I guess you could say, cohesive, more so, because think about it. Who in the world's going to try and conduct a coup d'etat and a possible civil war in Belarus now that the central government has access to nuclear weapons? If the government is incredibly unstable, it's not out of the question that they could start using tactical nuclear weapons on the supporters of a coup or a possible beginning of a civil war, making sure that the Belarusian government, even internally, may be, even just on the mental mindset of people who may be not in the most favorable conditions with the Belarusian government, a lot less apt to try and work against them. Because they're going, if they have tactical nuclear weapons, who's to say that creating a coup d'etat and then that devolving into a civil war, those tactical nuclear weapons wouldn't be used inside of Belarus on an opposing group of people in Belarus? That's another thing. It also could be, like, you know, and that's not something that isn't that far out of the question. We've already heard that the Belarusian Armed Forces appears to not really have that much loyalty or even follow orders of the central government all too much from what we understand. And not only that, we also know that there's a massive contingent of people inside of Belarus who want the Belarusian government that currently exists under Lukashenko to be gone. So going off of that, there is a good reason, even for internal security, to give the Belarusians tactical nuclear weapons. It puts everything on a freeze. No one can do anything to Belarus foreign, and no one can do anything inside of Belarus domestically against the government without facing possible nuclear retaliation, which could end up being a serious issue. And so with that, I think that may be a reason to explain why they're there. But once again, I just find it hard to believe that this would be a bluff, because it's not a good one. It would cause nothing but massive issues around the world, especially...
You know, I was just thinking, it just popped in my head. The only advantage that I could possibly think, and this took a lot of thinking to even come up with this is one possibility, is maybe Putin gave, if he did, the big if, maybe he gave nuclear weapons to Belarus to encourage them to actually get actively involved in the war in Ukraine. Because if Belarus were to go into Ukraine, that would open Belarus up to much more close scrutiny by NATO, potentially causing some backlash toward Belarus. And maybe Putin's mindset is if we give Belarus some nukes, they might feel protected and they might feel more inclined to help out in Ukraine if they have that nuclear sort of like backstop to protect them from NATO interference.
Maybe so. That could really be the case, because also, like I was saying, kind of working off of what I was saying, it protects them from foreign and domestic issues for the large part. It really starts to put a freeze on any kind of change that could happen. And so going off of that, if they join the war, NATO isn't going to conduct military intervention on Belarus because they joined the war. They have tactical nuclear weapons. And no one in the government is going to try and conduct a coup d'etat because the Belarusian central government is now in control of nuclear weapons. And so this could be an attempt to try and encourage the Belarusian government by making sure that their permanence is a lot more solidified to try and get involved in the war. That is actually a really good conclusion. And we'll just have to wait to see what comes out of this. And some people are saying, and I have to put this out there because I'm seeing a decent amount of people going, oh, come on, that can't be true. We got the same thing a while ago when we said that American missiles were being used on Belgorod. Literally hours after the approval had been officially given for that, people were going, oh, come on, that's not true. You're just clickbaiting. That's hype. No, it actually came out today that Belgorod was hit by HIMARS missiles. That was confirmed today by Forbes. And so we do know that that information was true that we put out several days ago. I can't help, folks, that we're always days ahead of everyone else. I hate to say that all the time because it sounds really arrogant, but it's honestly true at this point. I can't help that we're days ahead of everyone, and everyone else in the world will catch up to this in maybe 3 days. But right now,
still early? I'm telling you.
Man, we're always early. I mean, we're so early. People don't even believe the stuff. They think it's clickbait until 3 days later, and then people go and say, "Oh, I'm sorry, man." And it's like, why don't people just believe us from the start? Like, it's not all of y'all. Most of y'all believe us because we do a lot of research for this. But some people, it's like, why don't y'all just believe us? It's not like we're coming up with this stuff out of thin air. Like the statement today confirms what we said, I think 3 or 4 days ago. In fact, looking at this, it would have been about 2 days ago when U.S. missiles started to strike Belgorod. So there you go. That's all I got to say. We were right on that. We didn't need an official confirmation on that. We just logically assumed it. We have official confirmation on this already. So we already are able to remove a lot of the hypotheticals out of the scenario and say that this is probably a reality at this point, that the Belarusians are in control of these weapons, and then trying to figure out what will be happening as a result of that. But with that, I hope that does address that the best we can, at least with the nuclear situation. And we also got to see that at the exact same time in Kaliningrad, major flooding is occurring. We understand that it's apparently because of a lot of rainwater falling in the area, but it has literally flooded the city. From what we understand, because Kaliningrad is largely on a flat plain in this area, the entire city is submerged in a layer of water. And so let me show you all the clip.
That's crazy, man. Kaliningrad's turning into a lake.
Man, Lake Kaliningrad, блин.
Такого я еще в своей жизни не видела. Ну что, ливневочки не работают, молодцы. Город просто затопило за 20 минут. Вон, вода. В автобусе.
Oh, there's water in there. Look at that.
Oh, dang. Dude, they were a little underwater right here. Look at this.
Вода. В автобусе.
Dude, go fishing. Do something like that.
Да.
I like how they waited literally a whole minute of filming before they actually like looked down like, oh, there's actually water in the vehicle too.
Yeah, I was like, that's something I would have paid attention to first. But then we got another clip showing the heavy rainfall and the flooding that's occurring in Kaliningrad. And then moving on from that clip and on into the next one, we also got to see a staircase that got turned into a waterfall because of the massive amount of rain. And then moving on from that clip and into our last one, we once again got to see the deepness of the water. And this goes all the way to the river in Kaliningrad.
Oh, who knows what's in that water? She's walking right through it like it's nothing.
Nice, delicious poo-poo water. I would say that this is probably more toxic than the Seine right now because of how high it's gotten. But beyond that, still, it looks like the Russians will be dealing with another humanitarian crisis in Kaliningrad, a lot like they had to deal with in the area of Orsk and Orenburg a while ago. But moving on from that news and on into the Russian Federation, we also got an additional bit of news that apparently the Russian media, the Russian army has been putting out some ads in the media about joining the armed forces, and let's check it out. Let me get you all over to the English translation. So let's see, ad, 18 plus, one-time payment, 495,000 rubles. From 195,000 rubles per month, bonuses, social package, family support, contract with the homeland. Find out the terms of the contract, and then they got the link right there. And so let me go and put this out there for y'all really quickly. Let's go get the rubles to dollars translator. So let's see here. 495,000 Russian rubles would be about a $5,473 one-time payment, which isn't that much, to be entirely honest. And then you get about 195,000 rubles per month fighting in the Russian army. And so let's put that in. 195,000 rubles. Oh, wait a minute, put that in wrong. 195,000 rubles is about $2,156 per month. This means that if this was true, which we know that they're not getting paid, but if this was true, they would be getting paid about the same as I think an E1 in the U.S. military. So good job on them. It looks like they finally matched their pay, at least in fiction. But in reality, the pay is still considerably off, considering most of them don't ever get paid. They just kind of get forced into Ukraine and then they get stuck there. But still, love to see the ad.
Also, it's like, is that pay really worth it, considering you're probably not going to return, and also your family's not even going to get a real payout? You might get a potato.
Yeah, I mean, like water park tickets, a chocolate cake, maybe a potato. It's like, it's not really family support. And also social package is like, what's the social package? All of the other Russian soldiers like abusing you? It's like, that's not really a social package. Yeah. And then bonuses, like the only bonus you're getting is another black eye in the Russian army from your folks beating you up. I mean, there's not really a lot to be had that would be nice in the Russian army. So I don't know. I wouldn't really believe the ad, but I still wanted to show y'all what the Russians are doing to try and recruit these days. Meanwhile, moving on into Ukraine, it's now time for us to finally get to the Vovchansk front, because we have had a lot going on down in this area today so far that is really showing us that things are not going well for the Russians. Behind the lines, we also got to see that Belgorod has been hit by the HIMARS. We touched on that a little bit earlier, but we have to make sure to circle back around now that we do have official confirmation, because back several days ago, we were met with video clips like this, and I'll be showing you all one of them right here, of air defense that was active over Belgorod. We stated at the time, without any official confirmation or any video evidence where we could clearly see the incoming missiles to prove or disprove what kind they were, we stated that those missiles were American and that this was the first time that American missiles had been used in an attack on Russian soil. And a lot of people immediately bucked that and said that we had no confirmation for that. This is all hype talk. This is all fear-mongering. And it's simply not true. Things that we've been met with many times over 830 days of running this channel. And now, today, 2 days later, we have been able to hear that according to Forbes, and to read this directly, Ukraine hit Belgorod with a HIMARS system a few hours after authorization from the President of the United States. And then a direct quote, on Friday, the White House erased its red line. The same night, the Ukrainian army aimed some of its wheeled HIMARS launchers at the Russian city of Belgorod, according to the publication from Forbes. So going off of this, Forbes now has confirmation that we've been looking for, that the United States government did approve the use of those weapons and that HIMARS were fired at Belgorod and did end up hitting the city. Meaning that the information...
Isn't that crazy? It's like the U.S. literally got on the phone and called up Zelensky and said, all right, Zelensky, you got permission. He said, say no more. He hung the phone up and said, fire now. He started firing. He's like, damn, they were ready to go.
Dude, Zelensky said, hello? Oh, really? Real shit? Thank you. Click. And then he picked up another phone. It's on, boys. Get them. And then they're like, yes, yes, President Zelensky. And they just started firing immediately. I mean, that is That is something impressive right there, how quickly that plan was executed. And it looks like they just had a load of targets. I guess they already had the GPS coordinates for them. And so they just gave over the GPS coordinates immediately to the HIMARS batteries, and they just started slamming them. Which is really something to think about how quickly they ended up executing this. And also, it's really nice to see, circling back to this, that we were able to report that information correctly 3 days before everyone else could, because it's 2 days later, so this means that it's really 3 whole days since we reported it, and now we're finally seeing that there is official confirmation to back up the story. So, very nice to see. Once again, not trying to make an ad out of this for this channel or anything, but you can always count on us using enough common sense and logic on this channel to be able to call some things. We don't do that often, but with that, we called that well in advance. We said that those were HIMARS missiles being fired into the area of Belgrade, and that ended up being entirely true, as we can now see today. We very rarely do that, but when we do enough research and we have enough information to be able to confirm that that is the case, and that's what's actually happening. Of course, I will say this, however. I would generally steer clear of channels that do that as a daily basis, because while we do that every once in a while, it's not often. And this is one of the few times that we've done it, I believe, over this past few months in this year. In a lot of people who do that all the time, they will end up being wrong. I think we have ended up being wrong on some of these predictions in the past, maybe 1 or 2 of them over the course of the war. So if you see someone doing this like every day, I'd kind of be a little bit leery about that, because you can't predict everything like that. But still, with that, I hope that does address that the best I can. And with that, it's now time for us to actually move on into the Vovchansk area. And we have been able to see that while our frontline map from Deep State UA has not really shown any kind of major changes, we did see something that did show us that there was some significant changes today, as the front line is now going into a counteroffensive led by Ukraine. In the area around Plina, or more so called the Lipsy front at this point, we understand that Ukrainian forces have been able to push forward considerably and possibly have made it into the area. And let me make sure to show you all this so that way I can back this up on video footage in a second. It appears that they have been able to make it into the general area. And let me see here. Where in the world is this? I'm trying to make sure that I get this correct, because there was a tree line up in this area that I pointed out the other day and said that this would be an advantageous firing position. And it appears that it may be this one right here, Lukashenko. We do understand that Ukrainian forces were pushed out of Lukashenko and Hlaboke for a small while and ended up having to retreat back to the area of Lipsy, but it appears that the advance has already brought them well into range of Markovets, as we saw today that Russian white phosphorus rounds were being dropped onto what appears to be this tree line right here to try and stop or slow Ukrainian forces that are advancing towards the border area. And we were able to see that in this clip right here. Now we're going to be, it tried so hard. We're going to be muting that, but we can see the white phosphorus raining down in this very similar location. It is a
It almost looks like Christmas decorations, but this is not anything from Santa. This is from the devil.
Man, that was poetic. I was like, man, it's a dang.
This is from Grampus, or whatever his name.
Krampus?
What's that thing called? Krampus. Krampus.
Dude, Krampus visits me, man. Krampus visits me at night while I'm sleeping and gives me those damn Charlie horses. Speaking of cramps, it's like, oh god, you wake up and your like whole leg is like contracted in on itself to the size of what the hell was that sub called, Matthew, that went down at the bottom of the sea?
The Ocean Gate.
Yeah, the Ocean Gate. I mean, that thing be crushed like the Ocean Gate. Man. But anyways, moving on from that, we did get to see the white phosphorus being dropped, and it does appear the Ukrainian forces are making their way towards the area of Polina in Markovets. This is showing us that there is a decent amount of momentum behind the Ukrainian offensive, and while Deep State UA has not updated the map, it is showing that the Ukrainians are making forward progress. And moving on from that area and over into the area of Vovchansk, we've also been able to get a lot of news out of this area here. But before we get into this, the Ukrainians still have a lot to deal with in the background. From what we understand, there are 30 to 50,000 Russian soldiers that are involved in this offensive in northern Kharkiv even now. And a lot of these soldiers are still in staging areas around the city of Belgrade and maybe even up in the area of Kursk, as we'll be bringing y'all to a small story that came out today from a Russian Telegram channel. A lot of people have been saying that sources have stated that France has given Ukraine permission to use the Scalp EG missile on Kursk Kursk and Belgorod oblasts, and a lot of people have been throwing in their thoughts about that, saying that it's an amazing, great thing, and some people having a little bit of apprehension about it. But Matthew, what are people saying about that, and what are you thinking about it?
All right, so it looks like about 80% said that's excellent that France has allegedly given Ukraine permission to use the scalps, but only in Kursk and Belgorod. And it looks like 9% said that's bad because they should allow for more attack areas and not just Kursk and Belgorod. And 5% said, it's whatever, really. And actually, I'm not in the 5% personally. I think it's a pretty big deal. If France has indeed given permission behind the scenes, it has not been announced publicly just yet. But if they've done that, that will be a pretty big deal. However, I will say it is a bit disappointing that it will only be Kursk and Belgorod, because that sounds very similar to the restrictions put on the ATACMS by the United States. So, it's a little bit disappointing, but then at the same time, I guess it's better than nothing. But hopefully, France and also the U.S. will open that up to the entirety of Russia, because apparently France and the U.S. must be on the same wavelength because they're doing the same thing. But we'll have to see. But Enforcer, what say you?
I'd have to say that, in my opinion, while it's not necessarily the greatest thing per se, it's still fairly good, and it will help out Ukraine to be able to strike targets deep inside of Belgorod and Kursk. But it is a little bit unfortunate that they're not expanding that to the Bryansk Oblast, or the Voronezh Oblast, or Rostov-on-Don, or Krasnodar. It's kind of weird that they wouldn't, but still, it is nice to hear that they are allowing that. That's great news. Hopefully it'll be expanded further in the future, and hopefully we'll be able to hear that those strikes will end up being devastating to the Russian forces in those rear line areas that really pertain heavily to what's going on in northern Kharkiv and what may end up happening in Sumy a little bit later. But before we get into that, really quickly, I would like to say that the fundraiser has reached $2,000 for Nova Ukraine, which is unbelievably impressive, but we're still $1,000 away from the goal. And so if you would like to support the fundraiser, make sure to, because it does massively help out in Ukraine, and the Lee Spring Army has never missed a goal. And I know that we're not going to miss one tonight either. We are going to make sure to make our way to those $3,000 and make sure that Nova Ukraine can continue to help out once again in the area of really the entirety of Ukraine. But with that, Mandy, I believe that we actually have something that is coming up that we haven't done in a long time. A long, long time.
Oh?
It is maybe some sort of an order. One of the orders that are issued by Lee Spring Army Command. It's something that we haven't done in a long time, Mandy. A really, really long time. And I think you know what I'm talking about. Order! General order! A general order is now in effect. If you are a member of the Lee Spring Army and you have the ability to support the fundraiser, throw in a $5 donation to this fundraiser so that way we can get it over the top and to victory. I'm going to be making sure, actually, to throw in $20 of my own. It's not $5, but it's still $20. It's more than $5. It's $20 to make sure to help out. But a general order is now in effect. I sadly do not know the numbering convention anymore, so we're just going to call it a general order. But there is my $20, and if everyone can follow the general order and throw in some support to this fundraiser, we will be able to get it over the top and get the Lee Spring Army once again to victory over the fundraiser goal. And so with that, while that general order is going absolutely ham, it is now time for us to move on into a little bit of news in the Vovchansk area, because Vovchansk is Funchansk, and there is no other Chansk to watch the Russians get vomped like they are in Vovchansk. But moving on into the area, we were able to see that the Ukrainians were firing some M777s in support of their infantry today in the area. Sadly, I will not be able to play the music, but we can see them deploying the M777 right here.
Dang, man, that fundraiser is going fast, though. It's up to 2.4 thousand raised already. It's
Dang.
crazy.
Man, we are 2.5, actually. It's up to 2.5 now.
Oh, it's a palisade.
Come on, LSA. We can do it. We can get above 3,000.
Oh, my gosh. It's going fast.
Man, it is going. Like, it is flying. 2.6. And we can see them firing their M777 in the meantime. And again... And again, in slow motion, which looks really cool.
Oh, we're over 2 point. We're at 2.8. 2.8.
Oh, we are right
Getting
at
close.
2.8. We are about $200 away from meeting the fundraiser goal.
Oh, it's getting so close. Oh.
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 Until we sound like dying animals. But moving on from that and on into our next clip in the area, we also got to see that some Russian army that was attempting to support their forces near to the area of Staritsa, just to the west of Buhrovatka and a part of the active battlefield, was slammed by Ukrainian forces and destroyed. And we see the artillery coming down near the Russian vehicle as it's making its way through that opening. And we now see the FPV
9,000.
Oh, dang. Dude, we are like $60 away right now. $60 away from the goal. And that was at T55 AM, by the way. That is ancient.
Literally right there.
Oh, my Lord, man. We are we're about $50 away right now from $3,000. The fundraiser goal for the night. And we see them continuing to slam FPV drones into the back of that vehicle right there.
General, order.
Order. But with that, that's the end of that clip right there, but very nice to see. And so moving on for, Jacob Smith threw in a 20, and Evan Ashley threw in a 20. We are $4 away from the fundraiser goal. Can we hit it? We can hit it. We can do it. Hey, we hit the goal!
We hit it! Let's go!
Let's go, baby! I'll be damned.
That's what I'm talking about. Slum Ukraine.
We did it. We're now up to $3.1 thousand, and that is absolutely incredible. I got to thank everyone who's been a part of this fundraiser tonight for helping out and helping to reach that fundraiser goal, because Nova Ukraine is an amazing nonprofit that has been helping out across Ukraine for an incredibly long time, doing a massive and wonderful amount of things. And I got to say that it's incredible to see the Lee Spring Army pull together again tonight and was able to get its way over that fundraiser goal. If it wasn't for all of y'all, we wouldn't. Al Rouse threw in at 333. Dang! Oh my Lord, we're almost up to 4,000 now. Insane! But beyond that,
impressive.
But still, absolutely amazing. I got to thank y'all all once again for helping out with that, and once again making sure that this channel can actually have a small impact on what is going on in the kind of news that we cover. And so with that, we are now going to be moving on into our
You
next...
want to smash those top donors? You want to call out those top donors real quick?
Call them out!
Smash them. You want to call them out?
Call them out. Call them out.
Let's get to calling them out. And first up, we had the largest donation of the night, which is Hal Rose, who threw in that $333 donation a moment ago. Huge shout out to Hal for that huge support literally every single Sunday to the fundraiser. Also, huge shout out to some guy called the Enforcer, who threw in a 100. Also, Hal threw in another 100 for a total of 433. Quick maths. And we also have a 100 from Andy L, a 100 from Snook, as well as Chuck U. Farley, as well as a 100 from David Safranek, as well as a 50 from Wayne Matthews, and a 50 from Axel K, Plant Lady, Mark Young, Old Warrior, Snow White, Mike Smith, Greg Carrier, John C., Dad Good, BC Skyman, Vic Fazio, as well as a 50 from Ted Mitchell, Carl Pattison, James Reyes, Andy L. yet again. Then we have a 50 from the Mr. Anderson, as well as Neil Vizanant, Tina, Russell, and also Bob P. And a huge shout out to all the top donors tonight for once again bringing us over that goal. And now we're almost 1,000 above goal because it's almost 4,000. So huge shout out to everyone once again. Even if we were not able to call your name off, huge shout out to making it possible every single Sunday. And seriously, a huge thank you. And Enforcer, what say you?
And I gotta say, it is absolutely insane to know that so many of y'all are constantly on this channel, and not only that, constantly making sure to support these fundraisers every single Sunday and help them to be a reality. If it wasn't for everyone, both the top donors and all of the other donors that we weren't able to call out, we wouldn't be able to make sure to have a massive impact in Ukraine and help out as a channel. Y'all make that possible. And both the top donors that we were able to call out and the folks that we weren't able to call out, y'all are all absolutely incredible. And I gotta thank y'all for having unbelievably massive hearts and making sure to continue to help out in Ukraine and actually have a positive impact. Something that a lot of people don't do. I mean, a lot of people can stand around and pose with flags of Ukraine and put little Ukraine symbols on their profile on Instagram, but very few of them are actually helping out directly over there. And that's something that y'all are doing every single Sunday. And for that reason, I thank y'all greatly. And I thank y'all for always being a part of this amazing Lee Spring Army. And so put an LSA in the chat if you agree and if you appreciate being a part of this amazing Lee Spring Army. And Matthew, I understand that a couple of people in the Lee Spring Army have even thrown in some questions.
Yes, they have. There's been actually a few questions tonight. And once again, just a quick reminder that tonight it's fundraiser night. There are no super chats. It's just fundraising tonight. So if you have a question for us, put at Enforcer Matt in the chat and then your question behind it, and we'll add it to the spreadsheet. And most likely, we'll probably have enough time tonight to get to most of them, if not all of them. And we'll get around to those near the end of the stream. But with that, our first one of the night is going to be from Avari Mendebratis, who said, "Are ATACMS nuclear capable?"
ATACMS missiles, from what I understand, might be nuclear capable. Let me make sure to look at that. ATACMS. And let's go look at the MGM-140 ATACMS. And let's see here. History, variants. Let's see here. From what I can tell, it's not. It doesn't appear that it has any kind of a nuclear warhead that has been designed for the missile. And let me make sure. So here's the chart that we have actually on Wikipedia, and it appears that it shows the warhead. This one has the cluster bomb. This one also has a different size cluster bomb, and this one is simply a unitary warhead, a WAU-23B. And so really quickly, let me go put that in, and let me go get the that exact warhead. Let's see here. Can we find anything from the Department of the Army? No. So it appears that it is only a conventional weapon. It does not have any kind of a nuclear capacity or a nuclear warhead that was designed for the missile. So it's entirely a conventional missile. And so with that, I hope that does address that incredibly well. And with that, we are on to the next one. Also, thank you for asking a really good question, because I really didn't know that myself either. But with that, we are on to the next one.
All right, and the next question goes to Doomsday Games, who says, "What happens if Belarus nukes Russia?" It would be a doomsday game. It would be terrible.
I don't even know what would happen. I guess the Russians would start nuking Belarus back. That is something that would be wild, wouldn't it? If they gave Belarus nukes and then the Belarusians nuked them. I mean, that would be crazy. That would actually be insane. I'm not going to lie. So with that, I would have to say, I don't even have an idea. I would assume that the Russians would just nuke them back as a equal response, kind of like a mutually assured destruction sort of a deal. But interestingly enough, y'all may not know this, the Russians do not believe in mutually assured destruction. They believe that there will be life after the bombs fall. They believe that war never changes. And in fact, they have a company called Tech Vault that is currently helping the Russians to try and find a way to survive. I'm just kidding. They don't have any of that crap, but they actually do not believe in mutually assured destruction. No joke. That's why during the Battle of Mariupol, when the battle made it to the Azovstal, a lot of people were like, why the hell does the Azovstal have basements that are that big? That's actually because those were built not really as basements to the buildings. Those were actually built specifically as bomb shelters for the Russian, for the Soviet population, so that way if there was an attack, they would be able to hide inside of these basements pretty much as bunkers until the fallout was over, and then they'd be able to crawl back out and get back to living life in a nuclear irradiated hellscape. Same thing with Kyiv, actually. That's why Kyiv has incredibly deep metro stations. I believe they're actually the second deepest in the world behind Pyongyang's, is specifically for that reason, which is very, very bizarre that the Soviet Union had that kind of a mindset. Because here in America, it was just assumed you're screwed. Like, there was really no good preparation in the United States. They were like, hey, you know, there might be a public bomb shelter, but most of y'all are just going to die. And that's why we don't want to go to nuclear war. But with that, I hope that does address that at least the best I can. And with that, we are on to the second question.
All right, and the third question of the segment is going to go to your boy Troy, who says, "What will NATO response be if Belarus actually uses one of those tactical nukes on someone?"
Can you reread that one again?
He said, "What will NATO's response be if Belarus actually uses a tactical nuke on someone?"
If Belarus used a tactical nuclear weapon, I would assume that would be such a unbelievable situation. It's actually really hard to say how we would react, and I hate to say this because These are really, really good questions. The thing is that we don't know how we would really react to that because this has never happened. That would have never happened before. The only time that nuclear weapons have ever been used, it was by the United States of America on Hiroshima and Nagasaki inside of Japan. Those are the only times in history, the only two times that nuclear weapons have been used as an extenuation of warfare. Beyond that, the only other times that nuclear detonations have ever happened, they were always a part of testing. So going off of that, I would have to say I don't really know when the world would happen if the Belarusians were to nuke Ukraine. A lot could happen. We could immediately start to retaliate by conducting preemptive nuclear strikes on Belarus. We could end up internationally condemning them, everyone. We could start to say that the Russians and Belarusians are in violation of non-proliferation treaties, and that could start a massive armed standoff and then a conventional war that would lead to a nuclear conflict in Eastern Europe. There is really no good way, however, to say how we would respond. It's kind of like saying, how will the Chinese fight? Because one thing that's really interesting, and some of y'all who are on Patreon may have seen this today, is that I have an unbelievably large amount of books on the Chinese military. Matthew knows because I will just go around the house now, and I'll be like, fun fact, did y'all know? And Matthew's like, please, for the love of God, stop! But I'm actually learning a lot about the Chinese military, and one of the most interesting things about the Chinese military, and this kind of pertains to what I'm talking about here, is that we actually do not know how they will perform in a full-scale conflict, either against us or even against Taiwan, because the last time that China was involved in a war was 1979. They have not been in any kind of a conflict since then. Not a single one. And the only other instance we have of a Chinese combat engagement was a peacekeeping operation that occurred in Africa where they ended up sustaining losses when no other country did. And it also appeared that their their unity command was literally non-existent, and also any kind of communication amongst the units was also non-existent as well. So going off of that, this situation is kind of similar to what Chinese fighting styles would look like. We really don't know because it's never happened before. We have no idea. And also, by the way, I cannot wait to make the long-form documentary video just going down a rabbit hole, since we're kind of on the topic of things that have never really happened before, but we kind of have to guess how it will happen. I am so excited to eventually make the video about the Chinese military and a possible invasion of Taiwan, because the more and more I'm reading, the more and more interesting it's actually getting. One thing that's really interesting, and I don't think I actually got to say this today, Matthew, but one thing that is incredibly interesting about the Chinese Air Force and Army is the Air Force can't really support the Army.
Oh?
Like you know, like
I thought there was more to that.
like you know, like well, there was gonna be more. I thought you were gonna be like, why is that? And I was gonna be like, well, here's why. But you know how with the United States Air Force, we will achieve air superiority or air supremacy, and then we'll begin close air support missions for friendly forces to make sure to clear the way for them so they can advance. That's like how our air doctrine works. So with China, they don't have anything like that. They don't have anything like that because the Army and the Air Force are hardly able to communicate with each other on a tactical level on the battlefield. So for a unit on the ground, like let's say that a Chinese unit was on Kinmen Island or Kinmen County, and they were in this area near the Jining Township, and they were facing heavy Taiwanese resistance, they do not have a ground-air coordinator like the United States would. I forgot what those guys are specifically called, but they do not have one. And also, the Chinese Air Force has no communication with the units on the ground, so there would be no close air support of any kind. Like, there just wouldn't be any. So what the Chinese would have to do if they want support, they would actually have to communicate not with the Navy, not with the Air Force. They would actually have to communicate with the Army itself or the rocket forces and try and have the area bombarded with artillery. The only way that the Chinese Air Force works in an actual combat scenario, from what's understood, is in a strategic level. So the only thing that the Chinese Air Force would do would be striking far behind the active front line. So they would be going for radar sites, supply storage sites, munition caches, command headquarters, artillery batteries, things like that. They wouldn't be firing or actually using any kind of munitions close to the front lines because there's absolutely no communication within friendly forces. So the Air Force doesn't even really know where the friendly Chinese forces are on the ground because they're not communicating with them, and there isn't really any effective communications in between the Air Force and the Army of China. So
So you're saying it's just a problem. It's just a problem with them not having a proper like structure to communicate, like combat controllers, or you're saying it's a problem with like they don't have the technology to communicate with each other.
they don't really have the structure to communicate properly to actually create a combined arms sort of a situation is the best way to put it, because they do have combined arms on the ground, but the Army and the Air Force don't have any kind of a system where they properly communicate with each other, like at all. Like from what the U.S. Army knows, that is brand new. It's in its infancy. They said there is a limited number of Air Force fighter, well, really more so fighter and multi-role aircraft wings that might be able to conduct missions like that, but for the large part, there is no kind of real communication, actual tactical level communication in between the Air Force and the Army to make missions like that possible. Because in the U.S.,
How recent is that information? Because I find that hard to believe that over time they haven't like adapted that. That sounds like maybe something they might have had maybe back in the day when they were having a little bit more instability in the country and their military wasn't all that powerful. But it seems like today they might have improved that maybe.
the book I'm reading is from late 2021, so that information is only about 2 years old.
Interesting. That's kind of hard to believe if they really don't have that.
Well, I mean, there's a lot that when you read about the Chinese military, it's really hard to believe. Like, for example, the Navy does not operate that far from China's waters. In fact, they have run into problems, even according to Chinese media, just traveling into the area of the Arabian Sea, because the Chinese Navy is not experienced at all with long-range naval expeditions.
Interesting.
Yeah, like it's all bizarre. You're like, what? It's like, wait a minute, that's real? And like they'll talk about it. And then also another big thing that happened in late 2021, well, really early 2021, according to the book, was that the Army actually finally ended up creating a limited communication system with the Navy where they could actually end up landing Army helicopters onto Navy LHDs, which was a massive milestone for the Chinese military, to the point that it was actually publicized on state media sites.
Interesting. That I gotta tell you that it's just honestly in my mind, I'm thinking that China has the capabilities that we have because they get intel in our military. They know how it works, and surely by now they would have identified that weak link in the chain, and they would have probably fixed it. So maybe we just don't understand the system that they're using or something like that, because surely they don't leave a gap like that wide open.
No, they have it. I mean, they have it, and also the one of the books I'm reading is the Op4 Smart book, which is like a amalgamation of not only the Army's book on Chinese tactics, but also covers a whole bunch of other stuff as well, including the political aims, which are completely detached from normal politics. So we can talk about it here. The political aims of China. China plans on having a military, and this tells you how far behind us they really are at the moment. They plan on having a military that will be up to par or close to par with the United States by 2049. Not now. Like, that is way off in the future that they even plan to be on par with us. And it's something that they're already falling behind on a little bit. Like, the book goes into detail, and this is something that I looked into today and pulled up, and it was true, even according to Chinese media. The People's Liberation Army, Navy, Marine Corps, which is fairly new, actually. It was created in 2016, and they've been growing at several brigades per year at this point. Xi Jinping actually visited the PLAN-MC's headquarters in the Southern Command Theater, or Theater Command, and actually told them, I highly encourage y'all, please, y'all have to work harder. Y'all are missing the deadlines for modernization, or as they call it in China, information. Y'all have to speed up, because y'all are starting to fall behind, and we will not be able to get to our 2049 deadlines at this speed. Like, he actually said that, and was actually confirmed on Chinese state media. And so that is It's just really interesting because also they said that they are planning, or like they are expecting, at least the U.S. Department of Defense is, that the Chinese Air Force will almost be completely modernized with fourth generation and fifth generation airframes by the end of this decade. But right now, probably around the time we're talking, around 35 to 33% of the entire People's Liberation Army Air Force is made up of aircraft from the 1960s and 70s that would actually be in combat roles.
I mean, you can say what you want about the Chinese. I personally don't think the Chinese are at the same level that the U.S. is at. It's going to be hard for literally anybody around the world to meet exactly what our levels are because of the amount of money we spend and also the size of our military. But at the same time, though, China has a sizable one, but they're not trained probably as well, but they're pretty close. But in my opinion, the only rival around the world that can actually compete with our military is going to be China. Obviously, for a long time, people thought Russia was going to rival us. That's not true whatsoever. They were considered, I believe it was the third largest military and the most powerful in the world before the Ukraine war started. And all of a sudden, all the experts kind of went a little mum whenever they saw the failures happening in Ukraine. Because like, if Russia can't even handle Ukraine, are they seriously going to handle the United States? And the answer is clearly no. So to me, I would say that China is probably a little bit more powerful than we're thinking, because at the end of the day, they did send a balloon over our territory, and we didn't do a damn thing about it. It's just so, there you go.
Well, I mean, I don't know. I'll have to save most of this for the video that's planned on being made, but it's incredibly interesting. But Matthew, I can't sit there and say, well, maybe you have a point because all of this is coming from Army intelligence. This is what they're understanding the Chinese military to be capable of from everything that they've been able to collect. Probably a load of people who are in China trying to gather information on the army over there. I mean, I would feel like I would understand that they have a pretty good grasp on what the situation is with them, because usually it's the military itself over here in America that will end up overplaying things massively. Like throughout the entirety of the Cold War, they overplayed Soviet abilities so much that even now, weapons we made like the F-15 to fight the Soviet Union are still some of the best planes on Earth because of how much we overplayed Soviet abilities. And so
We've got a good, powerful military. We've also got a very good intel community as well. But at the same time, though, they're not infallible. They have given us wrong information in the past. I'm not saying they're totally wrong on China or anything like that. But like, for example, the part about them not having JTACs or combat controllers, to me, I find that hard to believe because the Chinese are not stupid at all. They're very smart. And while their military may not be at the same level ours is at, I find it hard to believe they would not solve a simple problem like simply putting combat controllers into place if they knew about the problem. And, well, it's pretty simple actually. If they see that gap there, they just need to find a solution to fix it. And surely they'd put some solution into place to fix it.
Well, I mean, if you're going to talk about JTAC guys, that takes a lot to coordinate that. I mean, we didn't have JTAC guys until the late 60s, and we're talking about the Chinese going from almost a complete militia force in the 90s up until now. They're trying to become a completely professional force in the course of 40 years, really, and well, really 30 years, and that's a very short time to try and do something like this. And in introducing JTACs, from what I was reading, would be incredibly difficult because it's not just a matter of throwing guys down on the ground with radios. You have to train them on how to coordinate and communicate with the Air Force. You also have to make sure that the headquarters are generally combined or on the same page for the Air Force and the ground forces and able to coordinate missions or at least available aircraft around the ground forces at that time. You also have to make sure that there's some way for the JTAC to be able to communicate with a specific aircraft in that airspace and also figure out what airspaces would be under the control of one JTAC or the other. You would also have to make sure that they know where the active front lines are, which would take even more communication with the Army and the Air Force. I mean, it's an incredibly difficult thing. The United States makes it look easy, but a JTAC isn't just throwing a guy down on the ground with a radio and telling him, okay, call planes. If it was that easy, everyone in the world would have JTACs. But I don't even believe, from what I know, that the Russians have JTACs. Their Air Force operates kind of under a fairly similar manner. And that's why we see that they never drop glide bombs. Very rarely have they ever dropped glide bombs directly on the front lines. Usually they're about a mile or two behind the lines because even the Russian Air Force doesn't really know where the ground forces are at that specific moment, and usually they're trying to mitigate friendly fire instances as well. So that would be my take on it. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm not, maybe the whole army's wrong, but that's what I'm reading. So
And also, I think the Army gets their intel from like our intel agencies, right? They don't actually go out and send out people like the Army guys to go get intel. I don't think.
well, the Army, the Air Force, they gather their own intel through military satellites, and then the CIA could be gathering intel as well, among many other agencies. So it's really like everything that they can have put together.
Interesting. I mean, to me, I'm still gonna have to stick with my guns here. I think with all the resources that China has, even if it's complicated or simple, China could figure it out because they've got plenty of resources. They could simply hire people, figure out what they need to do, or just simply educate themselves on what to do to fix it. Because they literally copy everything we do, and copying the JTACs and combat controllers would not be that difficult for a country the size of China with their resources. So to me, I think they probably patched it. Maybe that's outdated information, but I could be wrong. But I don't know. I'm kind of on the side that China might have it figured out, and we're just probably underestimating them a bit.
Maybe. But maybe we can run a poll on that, see what people think, because it seems as though it's moving on into being opinions. But anyways, with that, it's time for us to move on back into the Ukraine war news in the area of Vovchansk, where we were able to see that there was a very interesting sighting of a brand new Russian SPG, the 2S-43 Malva. We have never seen this SPG in active service with the Russian Federation before. We were able to see it on drone footage today, and it largely appears to be a Russian version of the Caesar SPG, or a similar wheeled SPG variant, a lot like the Bodana. These kinds of SPGs appear to be becoming incredibly popular and incredibly common, not only with major Western nations, but also with nations like Ukraine and the Russian Federation, as mobility, more so than any kind of armor protection at all, is being heavily emphasized inside of artillery units to make sure that they're a lot more mobile and maneuverable, so that way they can move from pre-prepared fire position to the next and be a lot quicker in the shoot and scoot sort of a role. So very weird to see it, and very weird to see that it was deployed in this area, considering the low-quality troops present here. We would usually expect that the equipment would be worse off, but this is the first instance of its kind we've seen on the battlefield. Meanwhile, we also got to see that the Russians were attempting to dig a trench with a trench-digging machine, and it ended up getting destroyed. And we can see the trench-digging system down there on the ground moving on along.
Oh, Bliat, it's special equipment, Bliat.
Oh, dude, it's literally just an excavator. I thought it was like a special kind of like that little special like potato like harvester thing that they usually have. But no, it was just an excavator, and it got blown to smithereens by the FPV drone. And we can see here that the system is burning, and with that, that's the end of the clip. And moving on from that and into our next one, we also got to take another look at Vovchansk as someone flew over it with a drone again today. And we're going to be muting that really quickly, but we can see them showing the name Vovchansk on screen in Ukrainian. And we see them showing the destruction around the city. Of course, it's been a part of a heavy battle, not only the Russian offensive into the city, but the Ukrainian counterattack out of the city. We see artillery still slamming into the middle of the city. We're not really sure whose it is, whether it be Ukrainian or Russian.
Well, they left that alone at least. They didn't bomb that building.
It was a little damaged, though. I actually saw it in some other pictures. It looks like some of the roof ended up getting taken off in some areas. But still, it was not that damaged. Which is kind of rare to see that, because usually they do target the churches. But we can see them showing the rest of the damage around the city. And the fires
It is
at night.
unfortunate, though, that Vovchansk is going to be pretty much razed like the other cities that Russia's absolutely destroyed. It looks like they're determined to flatten it.
Yeah, I think that also they're certainly going to be trying to flatten it. Now that the Ukrainians control most of it again, they'll probably start throwing down a large amount of artillery. Also, by the way, this was filmed by the Ukrainian police, by the way. Just putting that out there. The police are still on the job in the area of Vovchansk. But with that, that is all the video and picture evidence that we have from this area. But speaking of the Chinese, like speaking of the Chinese, since we just went through this massive discussion about the Chinese military in the People's Republic of China, Zelensky has said that China is helping Russia by not attending the peace summit. And some people are wondering, is he being naive on China? And some people are saying, yeah, Zelensky's being naive. Some people are saying that they're a little unsure because maybe the Chinese can be trusted. Some people are saying that Zelensky actually hates China. And then some people said, no, Zelensky needs China to win. But we've seen opinions all across the board on this. Matthew, what are people thinking and what are you thinking?
All right, so overall, it looks like about 27% of the people said Zelensky's being naive on China, 22% said Zelensky actually hates China, and 14% said Zelensky needs China to win. And when I say Zelensky needs China to win, I mean he doesn't want them giving aid and resources to Russia to fight the war in Ukraine. So on this one, I would have to say that in my opinion, in my observation of the entire course of the war, Zelensky's always sort of like given China sort of like a soft spot a little bit, the way he sort of deals with China. On one hand, I understand that because Zelensky's not trying to get a complete odds with China, so that way China doesn't go headlong into supporting Russia completely. But at the same time, we have seen intel from Western agencies suggesting that China is giving dual-use goods to Russia, and that now China is shipping stuff which is more directly associated with war goods to China to fight Ukraine. So it's being proven that China is against Zelensky's interests, but yet at the same time, he was wanting China to show up to this peace summit, knowing that they're supplying aid to Russia to fight their country. So to me, I think Zelensky's being a little bit naive. I think he's guided by good intentions here, but I think he should probably take a more firm stance with China. You don't have to go out there and, create the most mortal enemies with China. But I wouldn't go out there and pretend like China is really on their side, because China is definitely not aligned with Ukraine, because Ukraine is aligned with Western interests, and China is not going to support that. But Enforcer, what say you?
I would have to say that I would actually have to say that Zelensky is being a little bit naive on the Chinese. The Chinese have absolutely no interest in seeing the Western world prevail in Ukraine. Ukraine is not a neutrally aligned country. It is clearly a pro-Western country that it has NATO aspirations, plans on joining the Western sphere. The Chinese view the United States and the Western sphere as its rival and wanting to contain and stop the Chinese expansion into a great sphere, or as the Chinese call it, national rejuvenation, as I learned. Apparently that's what the Chinese call it. They would not want to support Ukraine, and they do not want to do anything that would further Ukraine's interest all too much. But on the other hand, they also don't want to do a lot to really join the Russians. And that's another interesting thing, is that diplomatically, beyond China's territorial claims on the Indian border, in the South China Sea, in the East China Sea, really with all of its surrounding neighbors, except for the Russians, they don't really try and get actively involved in anything on a diplomatic level. And that's something that is very interesting, that I was also reading about a little bit, because it seems as though the Chinese not only believe in a military doctrine called active defense, but their diplomacy also suggests that they do the same thing as well. They don't really engage or help out countries in sort of like a proactive manner. They only do it in a reactive manner. And I believe that in this moment right now, the Chinese are just wanting to sit it out and see what happens. Of course, they'd be rooting for the Russians in the end, but they're not going to really do all too much to directly support them or join Ukraine's side, because it would be a little bit out of the Chinese diplomatic sphere. Also, on top of that, while a lot of people believe that China is emerging as a world power, their power projection is actually wildly limited. It's usually contained just to their territorial waters and the seas surrounding China. In fact, China's navy is only built to be able to really handle the areas of the Yellow Sea, the East China Sea, and the South China Sea, not including any other area of the world. And for that reason, their actual power projection is incredibly limited. The only foreign base that China has is in Djibouti, he said. But anyways, it's in Djibouti, and it's an attempt for the Chinese to try and start expanding some of their power projection into the Middle East and Africa, although that has been met with some issues at the moment from what's been heard. And also on top of that, one peacekeeping operation in Africa, one of the few that they were directly involved in, ended up going fairly poorly, with four of the PLA soldiers involved injured, and I believe that they only had an entire squad there, meaning that they took about 30% casualties in a peacekeeping operation, which is incredibly rare for those kinds of casualties to occur. So going off of that, I don't really know if they're even in the position right now to really power project that much. They're growing, and they will eventually be in that kind of position, but I don't really think they're trying to get there right now. So with that, I hope that does address that well, at least in my opinion. So I would have to say Zelensky is a little bit naive on the Chinese either way, whether they're hostile against Ukraine or whether they're indifferent to them. It's a little naive to think the Chinese would care at all, and especially considering that they're a communist-aligned country. That would make it even less likely that they would care. But with that, I hope that does address that well, at least in my opinion. And with that, we are going to be moving on from the area of Vovchansk and on into the area of northern Ukraine near the Vovchansk, where we got to see that a Belgian APC was firing its Kanonen. Sadly, I can't play the audio. It was actually really cool sounding, but there was music in the background. But still, really neat to see that thing using its 25mm autocannon. Moving on from that and down into the area around Zolotarivka, we also got to see the Ukrainians destroying 2 MTLBs. Now we're going to be muting that. And we can now see the drone with a Mickey Mouse reticle flying around and getting ready to hit this MTLB. Oh, the leg's broken! Oh. But anyways, you can see the drone going right for the open door. And now it's cooking. They just cut straight to it cooking. And we can now see them bringing in another drone. And we can see it slamming into the back of the MTLB right there. And that's the end of the clip. But nice to see them knocking out 2 MTLBs in this area of the front line. Moving on from that and down into the area of Solidar, we also got to see that a HIMARS strike happened on a factory inside of Solidar that was housing some Russian vehicles. And it looks like it got hit really badly. Oh, looks like something's cooking. They got it on the griddle. And that's the end of that clip, but showing a little bit of the damage, and it looked good, buddy. It looked good. Moving on from that and into the area of Bodanivka, we also get to see a turtle tank getting blown up in this direction. And there goes.
Not a turtle tank.
Oublie! They're about to blow that thing up.
It's really wild how popular it is becoming on the battlefield by the Russians, like putting these turtle tanks literally everywhere.
Man, and look at that, man. Look at, is that a T-90M? Oh, here it comes. Any second now. Oh, who would have guessed it?
Oh.
Who would have guessed it near the pile of other destroyed tanks there would be landmines? Who would have thought? Well, they certainly didn't. But we can see that they now paid the price. And there goes the crew, immediately hopping out of the turtle tank. Actually, it looks like an entire clown car hopping out of the turtle tank. And, oh my god, it was a whole squad, dude! They put a whole infantry squad in the shell!
Oh my god.
Dude, they said...
It worked, though. They survived. They got out and ran off. It's ugly as hell. It messes the turret's, like, functionality up, but the guys at least survived on that one.
Dude, look at this, man. They were like, okay, Trevor on corner push. This is the Team 1 epic scatter, epic scatter, as they open up the back door and just start pouring out. I've never seen this before. I've never seen it being used as an APC like that.
They got a quick charbroiling, though.
Man, they got like a flash cooking in there. They're like, oh, my eyebrows, get out, run! And there they go, dispersing into the tree line, probably to get hit by some artillery later, but we didn't get to see that on film. And with that, That's the end of that clip, and moving on from that and on to our next one, we also got to see that the Kraken unit was in Chasiv Yar and was having a cracking good time. Look at that Soviet Red Star. Look at these guys just hanging out with an MG5. Look at these guys hanging out in this destroyed building. Look at these guys with their night vision goggles. Really cool. Really neat. And we also got to see that the Black Swan commander took a video today, but it looks like he was under some pretty heavy shelling in the clip. So here it is. Well, let me start it at the beginning. Ooh, dang. Oh my gosh.
Нормально.
You see him still waiting it out. The artillery's still landing close nearby, but the video clip ends, but still showing some of the heavy shelling that Ukrainian forces are undergoing in some areas of the front line. Moving on from that and up into the area of Otratine in the Avdiivka front, we also got to see a really wild video today of what I would say is a failed counterattack by Ukrainian forces in this area. Doesn't look like they took any dead. It looks like they may have taken some wounded, but the APCs advanced onto the tree line. It appears that the Russians were not suppressed, or they ended up opening the rear door towards the Russians, and this ended up creating a pretty hairy situation where they ended up coming fire as soon as the rear door of the M113 opened. Rarely ever show videos like this, but this one was so crazy how the battle unfolded that it had to be shown. So here's the clip. And we're going to be muting that. We're going to be waiting for the music to die, because from what I remember, it does die. You know what? I'm going to take a risk here. I'm just going to let the music play. If it gets copyrighted, that's fine, but the audio is necessary for this clip. So here it is. We hear the M113 laying down machine gun fire as the infantry are in the darkness at the back of the vehicle. The rear gate gets thrown open. We can now see the infantry attempting to move out. And then when you see them trying to fire out the back, the M113 has been opened at this point pretty much towards the Russian infantry, and the Russians can actually fire into the direct back of the vehicle. And you'll actually see that bullets start to spark off of the interior here in a minute. You see them trying to fire, we can see a bullet spark off the interior right there. We can now see them lifting the rear door up as they yell out orders for the machine gunner. We see the M113 trying to move out of the area. We now see that the M113 got hit by some kind of an anti-tank weapon. We now see them opening up the rear door, still taking fire from Russian infantry as they try and evacuate the M113 and move to another one that'll pick them up and evacuate the Ukrainian forces inside the M113. We see the machine gunner tossing out the PKM. And we now see another M113 moving up to the stricken one. It appears that it was almost hit by an AT weapon as well. We now see them trying to figure out how to evacuate some of the wounded from inside the M113. We now see him yelling out to the machine gunner on the other M113. We see an artillery explosion land nearby to the two APCs as our cameraman runs up to the M113.
Есть место в тебе! Повний! Їдь ви!
We now see that M113 now leaving the battlefield, most likely being told to by the Ukrainian, as Russian rifle fire continues to whistle overhead in the clip.
Що? Куди він поїхав? Вигружатися він повний. Нам куди? В яку сторону? Туди. Куди туди? Назад куди?
Now see the Ukrainians trying to figure out what to do, and it sounded like the M113 was actually starting to circle back, most likely towards the other M113 to pick up the wounded, but nevertheless, this was an unfortunate failed counterattack in the area, but nevertheless showing the kind of difficulties that Ukrainian forces can face, and also reminding everyone of how easy most times Ukrainian attacks go. The Ukrainians usually have a large amount of coordination and effort and planning that goes into their counterattacks, and usually we see them go off without a hitch. But if any of that planning or any of that pre-preparation fails or is not done accurately, that can end up being the end result, which appears to have been a failed counteroffensive by the small Ukrainian squad in the 3rd Brigade. Moving on from that and into the area of Berdichi, we also got to see that some Russians ended up surviving a hit and run. You see the Russians here standing next to a knocked-out M1150 breacher assault vehicle, an American-provided Abrams engineering vehicle.
Тихо! Стреляй по ним! Целиться, сука!
Oh, we hear a drone. We now see them trying to fire at the drone.
Блять, заходят.
Куда идешь?
Туда уходит обратно. На разворот, может, пошел. Сука, сюда идет. Сюда идет.
You see them continuing to kind of run around the assault vehicle.
Вон он идет. Откати вон сзади. Низко идет, низко идет. Блять, сука.
We now see them running because it sounds like the drone's coming for them.
Нормально все.
Живой!
Да, да. Нормально. Сука.
Пошли, пошли!
We now see the Russians regrouping after the drone exploded.
Блять, оглушу.
Давай, давай!
Автомат возьмешь. Я...
And now they run. it's...
О, блядь. О, блядь.
Ой, нормально, не ранен?
Не, нормально все.
We now see later on, the video has been clipped to where it's much later on. We now see them walking through the rubble of a building nearby, most likely within the area around Berdichi. And with that, that's the end of that clip, but still showing a little bit of the Russian side of things. That war not going that well in Avdiivka today. We also got to see some Russians driving up to the front and showing us that that's a fairly normal story for the Russian army. We see the camera getting flung around just about everywhere, and now they're going to go on a nice little motorcycle ride. See it destroyed Vovchansk, a lot of Neva. Another UAZ that was destroyed. A couple of destroyed Ladas that they were using for transport. We're going to mute that because actually I heard something that sounded a little bit like music in the background. Another Buhanka that was destroyed. And they're still going. We see them continuing to drive on. It looks like they're coming up on the next wreckage. Another Buhanka. Those seem to be common across the front lines as destroyed. And we can see them continuing on down the road. Another destroyed KAMAZ. Actually, the first one we've seen on the road.
Down with KAMAZ.
I got to say, Ahmad strong KAMAZ. But anyways, we can see they're continuing to go on. And it looks like they're coming up on another destroyed vehicle. And it appears to be a destroyed KAMAZ. Another KAMAZ. This is quite the long drive, and it's just showing us how bad off the Russian losses really are on a single road. And also, there's a lot of potholes, too. And we can see them slowing down here as they drive through a myriad of potholes. And we also get to see a couple of destroyed Russian vehicles. This actually appears to have been an outpost at some point that's been blown away. And now they're turning right and onto a dirt road. And I believe this is where the video ends, and it does end here soon. And then the video ends, but still showing us the just overwhelming losses that the Russians have taken in most areas. Moving on from that and down towards Opitne, we also get to see a Russian T-80 BV cooking. And man, look at that samurai, man. That guy is going, yo! But anyways, here's the clip.
Samurai's got some teeth problems. You might need to see a dentist over that.
Man, I used to have teeth like that.
Man.
Oh, man, I'm telling you what, man. Now, look, there's the T-80. There it goes. It's
Is
just
anybody else noticing tonight? The Russian bots are just flooding in here like crazy. Like, I don't know what it is tonight. I don't know if it's the fundraiser, the large fundraiser tonight, or maybe they're just feeling very upset because they're taking massive losses or what. But the Russian bots are in here and they're vehemently upset.
I've noticed that as well. I've been like, dang, there's a lot of Russian bots in here. And we can see the tank getting hit by a drone now. A nice solid hit on a nice, not so solid tank. And it certainly will not be solid here in a moment. It will turn into what we would call a plasma. But we can see here that the next drone is coming in. And boop, right at the back of the turret base. A nice fiery explosion right there, showing something is going to catch on fire here in a moment. And now we have the third drone. This one's coming in from the side, and I would bet you money it's going to go for the ammo carousel in the lower hull. And it looks like that's exactly what it's aiming for. It ends up hitting right about where it would need to, and now we can see that the tank is all the way on fire. Toasty, toasty. We love it.
Yes, flambe, burned. This tuna is not raw.
Oh, look, we got a big man here. Big man. Man, hot dog man. I'll realign your jaw. Oh, look at that. We got a big man over here. Big man. Look at him. But anyways, with that, that's the end of the clip. And we're now going to be moving on from that one and into the area of Pervomaiska, where we also get to see the Russians getting hit here too. Also, by the way, I'm going to be speeding this up a little bit because we still have a lot to cover. We still have location unknowns and a lot of frontline news, and we are a little bit behind. But we see the Russian running around, as they normally do. And we now see them getting hit. It's really nice to see them get hit like this. It really shows you the Ukrainians have their drone game down to a T. Fred Zerzow Sr. says, I saw that another channel says the Ukraine losses for May is 35,000. What say you? Where did they get that number? That's what I say. Like, the only people who are publishing numbers right now on losses is the Russian Federation, and those numbers we know for certain are wildly overinflated. So I would highly doubt that the number is 35,000 for casualties, wounded and killed. That would be an entire several brigades worth of strength wiped out, and Ukraine could not suffer those kinds of losses in a single month. The army would practically collapse. So with that, I hope that does address it the best I can. And we can see here the Russian running from the flame. It's a very rare instance. Usually they like fire. And slow! But with that, that's slow. And with that, that's the end of that clip. And moving on from that and down to the area of Krasnoyarivka, we also got to see some Ukrainians avoiding some dangerous rocket fire in Donetsk. Here's the clip. And we're going to be muting that. That sounded copyrighted already. So we can see them driving through the fields. Just kicking up dust, going as fast as they possibly can.
Whoa, what was that? Did you see
I
that?
don't know. It was like blurred out. I was like, what is that? Like I didn't say anything because I couldn't even decipher what it was.
It looked like it could have been a man.
Oh. Well, I couldn't really tell for sure, but we can see the rocket fire coming down all over the place. Wetton Sweener said, I don't think this guy likes Russia. No, I don't really like the Chinese either. Like you're good. We're good for catching on. I like the United
country,
States.
that is the government. The government.
Yeah, the government, the Russian government, and the Chinese government don't like him. But with that, I hope that does address that the best I can. And with that, we're now going to be moving on down into the area of Volodar, where you also get to see more Russians getting blown up. And just look at that. Just a montage of them getting stricken, toasted, roasted. It's nice. We got Firebirdies over there. And we can now see another column getting hit and destroyed. And with that, that's the end of that clip. Very nice to see. And moving on from that and on into our next one further down the line, we actually have a little bit of news from Simferopol, where we heard that the Russians plan on reactivating an airfield to the southwest of the city, possibly to try and spread out the Russian Air Force in Sevastopol, well, really more so Crimea, a lot more to make sure that if any strikes are conducted, the losses are greatly mitigated. But with that, it is time for us to move on to something that we've been talking about for a little bit on this channel. And Matthew and me actually had a little bit of a discussion earlier about. And Matthew, what is the poll about? What were people thinking? And what are you thinking?
So this poll question says, do you think China's military has major shortcomings which renders them inferior to the U.S. military? And specifically, this stems from the conversation about the lack or the alleged lack of combat controllers in China's military. So it looks like 65% said yes, China has major military issues, and it looks like 13% said no, China is simply underestimated by the USA, and 10% said China has equal problems as the USA. And on this one, I'm going to have to say, even though the majority said that China is inferior to the U.S. military because they have major issues, I'm going to have to stick to my guns here. I think that that Russia was highly overestimated, and that was very clear after the Ukraine war started. But on China, I would say they are different. China has vastly more resources than Russia has. They have a large manufacturing base, and even though their training may not be totally up to par to the United States, I think they have about as equal problems as the USA in their own right. Because, for example, the US is having a very hard time getting their recruiting numbers up, but you're not seeing that in China. So while China does have some pretty big problems happening, like, for example, if the combat control situation is indeed accurate and up to date, then that would be a pretty major problem. I don't think it's such a major issue that's going to render them basically not a rival to the U.S. To me, China is a force to be reckoned with. They're on a similar level to the USA, and we should prepare to deal with them in that manner. If we're wrong, at least we're overly prepared and not underprepared. But I think we're probably underestimating them a little bit. But Enforcer, what say you?
I would say that the Chinese military certainly does have major issues. You can say that they have been wrong in the past, but I can't discredit everything that Army intelligence has to work with, because Army intelligence, especially when talking about adversaries, has rarely ever been wrong in their combat abilities. We may have been wrong in the past with things like the Russian army's buildup around the border and saying that it was possibly going to be a war game, and also saying things like yellow cake uranium was in possession of Iraq's government and they were planning on creating weapons of mass destruction. But when it came to killing them, we did pretty good at estimating what kind of forces they had, what kind of weaknesses they would have, what kind of equipment and structure they would have, and what kind of weaknesses would be caused out of their command and also unit structure systems. And going off of that, I would assume that Army intelligence on China is most likely, if not entirely correct, on what's going on inside of China. Not only that, but the book that I'm reading specifically mentions exact quotes from Xi Jinping, specifically from the 5th plenum of the 19th Congress of the Chinese Communist Party, and also the People's Republic of China. And he directly states, as quotes, I'd have to find them and make sure to quote them, that the Chinese military needs to modernize to be on par with the United States by the centennial of the People's Republic of China in 2049. And he did not say that the People's Republic of China is on par right now and would be able to fight the United States of America in a peer-on-peer battle. He said that they are behind and they are currently in a moderately prosperous society, but they want to become a highly prosperous socialist society by 2049. And that would also include a massive growth of the army as well, as the army, the People's Liberation Army in the Chinese government, is viewed as the forefront of the people's revolution, or more so the endless revolution going on in China to further socialism and communism worldwide. So going off of that, it's the army is supposed to evolve at the same time as the nation is. And going off of that, the Chinese government even believes from their official statements that the People's Republic of China and the army is not up to spec or even close to spec on what the United States is, or being able to compete with them. In a regional conflict, they might be able to pose issues. Like with Taiwan, a fight surrounding Taiwan would actually be probably a peer-on-peer conflict for the most part, although there will be massive shortcomings that the People's Republic of China would have to overcome. For example, the almost complete lack of any kind of JTACs or ground communicators with the Air Force, and also on top of that, their poor coordination with the Navy, the primacy of the Army, which throughout Chinese political history has always taken precedence over the Air Force, the Navy, and every other branch that has been created for equipment and also funding, meaning that even now, with the Navy of China rapidly growing in the Air Force as well, they are still usually underfunded and under-equipped compared to their army counterparts. Going off of all of that, I would say that the Chinese certainly do have a bit of some issues to overcome. And also, Matthew, we can't forget that we were also the ones to cover the news that the Chinese had filled a lot of their rockets with water, so that way some corrupt government officials could sell off the rocket propellant for money.
Indeed, indeed. And also, unfortunately, real quick, I don't mean to jump off the train of thought here real quick, but I was doing some research because I was thinking when you said the U.S. military is usually not incorrect on their assessments, I went back to look because I remembered that before the Ukraine war broke out, there were a lot of military analysts and also people in the military saying that Russia was a force to be reckoned with. They said we need to watch out for Russia because they are becoming a major adversary and a political or a military threat to the United States. Obviously, we know now that's not true because their military can't even stand up against Ukraine. But back in 2020, it looks like here on the Army University Press's website, which is an official U.S. government site, it looks like Lieutenant Colonel Dan Sukman of the U.S. Army and also another Lieutenant Colonel co-authored a paper or an article here basically describing how Russia was a force that was progressively getting more strong, and we needed to worry about that because they're a very competent adversary to the United States. Obviously, in my opinion, I think they were proven wrong by that quite badly. But it goes to prove my point that the U.S. Army, while it is very knowledgeable and they have a lot of skill and a lot of experience, they can be wrong from time to time. And in my opinion, I think that the U.S. military's analysis of China is underestimated. I think we're underestimating them significantly. I'm not really sure why we are, because obviously China has big resources, so why wouldn't they be powerful? But I think they're doing that once again with China. They did the opposite. With Russia, they overestimated. Now with China, they're underestimating, in my opinion.
Well, I mean, I would have to disagree a little bit with the army being wrong. Some people were wrong, specifically Million, these two people that you're talking about, that I never heard of their publication before, but I know that Milley was saying things like that, and he was, what was he, Matthew? The chief of staff at that time?
Milley at which time again?
Before the war started. What was Milley? I forgot what he was.
I think he was, let's see here, that was
That was
the last
2022.
president.
Remember, he resigned, I think 6 to 8 months into the war, but I forgot what
Joint
position.
Chiefs of Staff, right?
I think he was the chief of staff, but he was the one saying that Ukraine would do poorly back then too. But the thing is that the reason, and I want to make this very clear because some people are like, oh, maybe you're just reading on China. I read on Russia and Ukraine as well years before the war began. And all the books I was reading then are almost the exact same kind of books I'm reading now. They were either amalgamations of army intelligence on the Russian Federation's armed forces and Ukraine's armed forces, or they were more so written inspired off of information that army intelligence was able to get. And going off of that, that's why I said once the war began that the Ukrainians were going to fare quite well, especially by the point of day 3 and day 4. I said they're going to be fine, and this is going to end up being a pretty lengthy war. Is because in Georgia and in both Chechen wars, there were very clear lacks of communication, unified chains of command, and also logistical efforts from the Russian Federation that ended up posing even massive issues on very small campaigns, like the Georgian War and the Chechen wars. And all of that information was based off army intelligence from the past, and really for the large part what army intelligence had gathered is Russian military abilities. And going forward, based off of those books that I read at the time, that's why I said at the beginning of the war, the Russians are not going to bow too well because they have a large amount of corruption and incompetence within their armed forces. It's inherently baked into the structure. The communication systems of the Russian Federation are poor or non-existent, meaning that units will not be as coherent or really as responsive as they would be on the Ukrainian side, considering that the Ukrainian army really had massive reforms happen in between 2014 to 2022 over 8 years, and the Russians did not. They would also run into massive logistical issues. And on top of that all, they wouldn't really have effective chains of command to allow for them to seize opportunities on the battlefield. All those things put together that I've been saying since the beginning of the war and ended up being true, I didn't get out of thin air. I got that from reading books that the Army either published or people published using Army information from Army intelligence. So going over that, like, I'd have no reason to really diss on Army intelligence. I have a reason to diss on specific people in the Army, like Milley, who said that Ukraine wouldn't survive a lick, when even Army intelligence shows different, and that I guess was just fear-mongering statements. That I will diss on, but Army intelligence, they did me right one time. They did me right for sure on the Ukraine war, because I just went straight off of what they were saying and everything in between. So on this, I'm going to have to do the same thing, because it would be kind of a silly thing, in my opinion, to read hundreds of pages of military intelligence and then just throw it all out the window and say, what do they know? Because they would have to know something, because otherwise, why in the world is the Army so successful in conventional conflicts like the Gulf War or other conflicts that we've been in? It's because they do a lot of research and work in the background to make sure that they know what they're going into.
The U.S. Army is very competent when it comes to actually on-the-ground, like, force projection, very competent at that. But on the intel side of things, that's where it gets a little bit more wishy-washy, in my opinion, because remember, the U.S. military is also the same ones that sort of led us into Iraq with the yellow cake uranium lie, which would turn out not to be true.
That was the CIA.
Or CIA, whoever it was, they believed it. And just like this information you're getting about China, they believed that as well. So, there are things that they've gotten very badly wrong in the past and that we've relied on and that turned out to be completely false. So, I wouldn't put it past them. Whatever they're writing in their papers, it probably is accurate, but I would have some doubts about it because they're not always correct.
To me, it sounds as though you're getting things a little mixed up, though, with how what people got wrong in the past and what I'm talking about right now. What the Army is talking about is China's military abilities. What you're saying that people got wrong in the past was the CIA getting something wrong about yellow cake uranium, which didn't exist, and Army intelligence had nothing to do with that information. What you would be talking about with Army intelligence would be like saying in Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2003, when we began to strike key sites in Iraq, they ended up striking wrong sites or completely outdated sites because their information was off. That would be something analogous to what we're talking about with the Chinese right now. It's also like, it's like Russia, like this would be a good example of what you're equating. You're saying that U.S. intelligence can be off, but if it was off the way you're saying, then it would be off just like Russia's when Russia started the invasion in February 23rd of 2022, and they ended up striking nothing but outdated Ukrainian military sites that were either deactivated or weren't even being used because their information was outdated. Like, what I'm talking about here is not a diplomatic mistake, like saying the Iraqis have yellow cake uranium or the government of Afghanistan could survive if we withdraw. I'm talking about the Chinese military and its abilities at the moment, not anything diplomatic or anything that may lead to a conflict, but if a conflict was to break out, what would their abilities actually be? And the Army is very rarely wrong on that, because like you're saying, they do well on the ground. They do well on the ground because they do their homework and they make sure to understand the enemy's abilities and their how their forces are even working on the battlefield before they fight them. That's a huge part of the battle.
Yeah, but you do agree they can be wrong, right?
Yeah, they can be wrong, but like wrong on this kind of information, it's pretty tough for them to be wrong, and they've very rarely ever been wrong on this kind of stuff in the past.
I would have to disagree with you on that. I think we'll have to agree to disagree. I think they are susceptible to the mistakes of everyone else as well. Like, for example, the yellow cake uranium thing, I brought that up not to try to make a reference between yellow cake uranium and also the lack or the existence of combat controllers in China, but just to indicate that information that the U.S. military is using can sometimes be faulty, and we're not exactly sure which agency provided that information to the U.S. Army. All we know is they're using the information, they believe it, and that's what they're going on. So we don't really know who got it, and whoever got it for them could be wrong, just like with anything else. We just don't know for a fact.
But the Army never had anything to do with the yellow cake uranium story. It sounds as though you keep on trying to shoehorn it in. The CIA was the one who went to Iraq and sent agents to Iraq to try and discover if they had yellow cake uranium. The agents stayed in the hotel for 2 weeks, returned back to Congress, and then reported to Congress that they had yellow cake uranium and were creating weapons of mass destruction. Then the Congress and the president decided that an invasion of Iraq was necessary. The Army wasn't involved at any level in that intelligence gathering or the execution of an invasion of Iraq beyond killing the Iraqi army.
But likewise, though, the U.S. could have sent CIA to go sit in their hotel room over there in China, and they could have done the same thing with the combat controllers as well. My point is they can get it wrong just like the other situation as well.
I think we will have to agree to disagree on this one, because I think we're at an impasse on that. But with that, it's time for us to move on to some questions, because I believe we have a whole, well, actually, no, sorry, correction. We have to move on to the speech from President Volodymyr Zelensky, and also the location unknowns, because we have a couple of those. But moving on into our little bit of location unknown news, we got to see a Ukrainian Sea King helicopter, which is pretty cool, because these were actually provided by the British and then painted up with a Ukrainian roundel, which is pretty sick. But with that, we are moving on into our next bit, where we also got to see what the final test for Ukrainian airborne assault forces look like, which was pretty whack. And we're going to be muting that immediately because I forgot it had copyrighted music. But the training involves a decent bit of fire, also getting attacked by dogs, apparently.
Damn, attacked by dogs? What kind of training is this?
It's that real hardcore training, apparently.
Make them eat dirt, too.
And they all look a little charred, I'm not going to lie, man. I feel like their uniforms are kind of blackened. And now they're going through the march so they can get crotch rot, which is always wonderful. We now see them crawling along the road, getting run over by a T-80B. T-80BV, actually. You see a parachute instructor here talking to the camera. We now see them rolling a Ural. Wait, did that guy have a crink? Do you see that, Matthew? He does! Look at that! Isn't that cool?
They've got AKs. What do you know?
And we see them crawling through the ground and over through water again. doing some line crossing challenges, I guess. Some boxing. Looks like they're kind of tired though. Looks like the boxing is a little lackluster because they've gone through hell at this point. And then finally graduating airborne school. I think they deserve graduating airborne school, going through all that. And with that, that's the end of the clip. But really nice to see. And moving on from that and into our next bit, we also got to see the Russians attempt to disarm a drone. And we see them tapping the board around. And it looks like they didn't disarm it too well. Yeah, it didn't disarm that great. But with that, we're now going to be moving on to how many Russians failed to disarm drones today, which was an incredibly high number. Oh!
Oh my gosh, 14 Bobcats. That's crazy, man. That is wild. 14 Bobcats. That is crazy.
What a day. What a day. I mean, that's pretty impressive right there. And 1,080 Russian soldiers were wounded and killed over the past 24 hours, along with 33 armored personnel carriers, 86 supply trucks, 25 main battle tanks, 49 artillery pieces, 82 drones, a single MLRS, 38 cruise missiles, 6 anti-aircraft warfare systems, and 14 Bobcat skid steers. Today was an impressive day for the Ukrainian armed forces, and once again, they were able to inflict the maximum amount of losses that we could see onto the Russian Federation. Very good to know, and great to see the Ukrainian defense is once again holding very strong. And with that, it is now time for us to move to Kyiv to cover the speech from President Volodymyr Zelensky here on day 830 of the war. And so, let me move down. Oh, it doesn't look like it's on his website again. So let me go to YouTube. Hey, yo, what's up, YouTube? And let me go to the President of Ukraine's website. And let's see here. We ought to be able to get it.
Speech. Can we please have speech? He does speech every night for a long time. We want another speech.
You'll get speech and you will like it. Let me find the speech. We got the speech at the plenary session, reimagining solutions to global peace.
And so here we go. This is it. It's 13 minutes long. We are going to try and play as much of it as we can, but that's of course time dependent. But let me make sure to get these subtitles up and in English. And here we go.
Thanks so much, Mr. Gigrich, dear Ministers of Defense, ladies and gentlemen, dear journalists. I'm pleased to address you here today at IISS Shangri-La Dialogue. For many years, in such summits, including here in Singapore, people discussed the importance of diplomacy. And it's often said that brutal force should not dominate the world. Similarly, attempts by various power centers to impose something on other nations against their will in politics, economy, or security should not dominate either. Diplomacy should be those caring and strong hands that prevent international disputes from turning into fights, restraining the most aggressive parties. This is how diplomacy often worked in the past. But frankly, the last few decades have not been a time for diplomacy. We have all felt this, and each region, sometimes even countries, has its own experience of how diplomacy has degraded, leaving only disappointment behind. In the 1990s, Ukraine suffered one of the greatest deceptions in the modern history when the security assurances from nuclear powers in exchange for the nuclear arsenal located in Ukraine did not translate into real security. It was exactly 28 years ago these days when Ukraine handed over its last nuclear warheads to Russia. In line with a multilateral international agreement, and it is Russia that has tried to erase Ukraine from the political map of the world. In the 2000s, Ukraine faced the first obvious violations by Russia on our territory and sovereignty, revealing that there was no element of the world's security architecture capable of restraining Russia and forcing it to stick to the principles and purposes of UN Charter. So Putin believes he is allowed to do anything. By the mid-2010s, Russia brought a war to our land, a war that we in Ukraine never wanted, did not provoke, and which expanded into the most treacherous invasion Europe has experienced since World War II. All of this was a series of diplomatic failures and constant attempts to keep the world divided into spheres of influence, which disrupts nations' lives and corrupts global powers. As a result, war. When unity was needed, the world was divided. When bold decisions were required, many were content with the status quo. And when preventive action was necessary to avoid the worst, the aggressor was somehow given time to prepare. We remember how Moscow tempted the world with the talks, all of which resulted in hollow wars or unacceptable ultimatums. Thus, we found ourselves in a war that now affects everyone in the world and spreads a globally dangerous cult of violence instead of trust in international law, trust that diplomacy should strengthen. But Ukraine will not complain, and I'm here to state we have found a way to restore diplomacy. This is the goal I spoke about last year at the Shangri-La Dialogue, and now we can make it real. Dear friends, not so long ago, it seemed that the world would always be fragmented. But we saw the most nations truly desire and are capable of cooperation, at least as far as collective security is concerned. A clear example are the coalitions from military to humanitarian, formal and informal, which help us withstand the war and prevent Russia from expanding it. These coalitions supporting Ukraine unite countries from all countries with different characters and worldviews. What brought them together? Naturally, diplomacy. Diplomacy does work when it truly aims to protect life. Together with partners, we are defending life and rules-based world order. We are working to obtain air defense systems and co-produce weaponry and drones. And we train our soldiers together. And we counter cyber threats together. We restore energy infrastructure damaged by Russian terror together. Just on Sunday night, Ukraine faced another round of Russian strikes. Nearly, during one day, imagine, nearly 100 missiles and drones. So this has happened hundreds of times throughout the war. And no country could handle this alone. And I thank everyone in the world who helps us with air defense systems, saving lives to our people, and the best, of course, the best Patriot systems, the United States, Germany, Netherlands, other our partners who helped us. Thank you so much. Together we are also bringing back Ukrainian children who were deported to Russia from the occupied territories of our country. And we know for sure about 20,000 Ukrainian children who were kidnapped by Putin, kidnapped and taken to Russia. And we know their names. And Russia itself claimed that it took several hundred thousands of our children from the occupied territories of Ukraine. Only the worst criminals do such things. And we must bring all of our children back to Ukraine, to relatives, to parents. Thanks Qatar for the help, and other countries, other partners also, together with our partners, we are bringing back our captured soldiers. There are already dozens such joint initiatives, and they work not only for Ukraine. Countries from Libya and Sudan, Bangladesh, consume food produced in Ukraine. All of them benefited directly when we lifted the Russian blockade of our ports and resumed our food exports. Initially, this was achieved through international mediation together with Turkey and United Nations. Later, when Russia left the grain initiative, we resumed our contribution to global food security, thanks to our soldiers who defeated Russia at sea. And already 50 million tons of cargo have been exported through our new maritime corridor. But this was also made possible by diplomacy that supports Ukraine's resilience in battles. Once again, diplomacy does work. Now we are creating a new security architecture for Ukraine based on bilateral security agreements with our partners. There are already 15 such agreements, and more will come. And these agreements are comprehensive, covering everything from defense cooperation to political and economic interaction. The diplomacy restored the world's habit of keeping with the terms of agreements in real life. Besides, we've proven that now diplomacy resolves issues that Europe has been unable to solve for decades. Specifically, we have secured real steps towards Ukraine's integration with the EU, and Ukraine will definitely become EU member, a part of one of the biggest global markets and security space. And the key point, of course, peace. Our experience of restoring effective diplomacy has led us to the format of the Global Peace Summit. We are convinced that our world wants to be united and be capable of acting in a complete harmony. We've realized that nations equally reject the idea of someone secretly making decisions and imposing them. What is needed is open and inclusive dialogue. We have confirmed that the principles and purposes of the UN Charter and international conventions are entirely relevant. All this has become the basis of our peace formula and has grown into the Global Peace Summit, so every leader and every country can show their commitment to peace. The global majority can ensure with their involvement that what is agreed upon is truly implemented, and so that Russia, who started this cruel war, cannot push us off the path to ending the war. More than 100 countries and international organizations have confirmed their participation in the summit for today. At the first summit, we will address 3 points of the peace formula: nuclear security, food security, and the release of prisoners of war. And of course, the Ukrainian children abducted by Russia. Time is running out, and the children are growing up in the Putin land, where they are taught to hate their homeland and are lied to, being told they have no families, while their loved ones wait for them at home in Ukraine. And after Peace Summit, when the global majority agrees on the common understandings and steps, the relevant parties will pass this to Russia, aiming for an outcome similar to the grain initiative. If these basic things are implemented, other points of the peace formula will work as well. Yes, Yes, we are disappointed that some world leaders have not yet confirmed their participation in the peace summit. Unfortunately, there are also attempts to disrupt the summit. We do not want to believe that this is a desire for monopolistic power in the world to deny the global community the opportunity to decide on war and peace, and to leave this power in the hands of one or two. We respect the UN Charter, respect every nation, and treat everyone equally. Only on this principle can the world be safeguarded from war. Ukraine proposed peace through diplomacy, an inclusive and fair former global peace summit, and I invite your region, your leaders, countries to join so that your peoples are involved in these global affairs, and by uniting against one war, we create for the world a real experience, the experience of overcoming any war and of diplomacy that does work. Thank you for an invitation. Thank you for your attention. Slava Ukraini.
And Slava. And with that, that is the end of the speech from President Volodymyr Zelensky here on day 830 of the war in Ukraine. And that moves us on after a 2-hour and 30-minute long news segment, crazily enough, on into our question segment, where we get to talk to all of y'all. I don't really know how long it's going to be going on, probably for the next 20 to 30 minutes or so, but I can't wait to be able to talk to y'all about whatever y'all want to talk about. But Matthew, I understand that you've asked the chat a spicy question. I mean, it's a question so spicy, I've seen people talking about it in the chat, and I mean, my goodness gracious, Matthew, what are people saying about it, and what are you thinking about it?
All right, and before we move into that poll, I just gotta say, Enforcer, I'm telling you what, we've got beef, because I cannot let it stand that you think that China is an adversary to the United States that's on such a low level.
Yeah?
I can't let it stand.
Oh yeah,
I'm
what you
not
gonna
let it
do?
stand. Oh yeah?
Oh yeah, tough guy, what you gonna do?
You know something I saw interesting, by the way, in the live chat?
Oh, what?
Some people thought that are a little like not really an argument. It was more like a debate, in my opinion. Some people took that as like, oh God, it's getting nasty. It's like, that's light. I thought that was light. To me, that's just an enjoyable light debate. You know, I'm not in law school anymore, but I did enjoy the debate part.
Yeah, I mean, that was fun.
That was fun, and I enjoy that. It's nowhere near arguments, and also we don't get in like up in a wad and stuff like that about, you know, who disagrees with who and stuff like that. An opinion is an opinion. My opinion is not going to change nothing, and Enforcer's opinion is not going to change nothing. Now, if he becomes the president one day, it might mean something, and then it might be worth fighting over. But if not right now. But anyways, moving into that poll question, it says, do you agree with Zelensky that the West has deceived Ukraine to give up nukes and then abandon Ukrainian security? 59% said yes, the Ukraine was lied to and then abandoned, and 26% said no, the West is helping Ukraine a ton. And on this one, I gotta say, if Ukraine was abandoned by the West, Ukraine would have already ceased to exist. That simply has not happened. And even though I understand why Zelensky made the statement, it really is not really true, because, you know, the West has provided over $100 billion at least in aid to Ukraine. So if that doesn't sound like supporting Ukraine, I don't know what does. The only thing the West hasn't done up to this point is put troops on the ground in Ukraine, and that might be changing in the near future, because now France is sending instructors and other countries are talking about it as well. So to say that we've abandoned Ukraine, that's not really fair in my opinion. I understand Zelensky's upset. He doesn't like the losses that Ukraine is taking. They're not taking nowhere near the losses that Russia's taking, but nonetheless, the war is taking a toll on Zelensky. And I think that's coming out in the statements a little bit. But Enforcer, what say you?
I would be honest. I hate to say something like this, but those are the exact kind of comments that the Soviet Union started to make towards the end of World War II, when they started to say that the Western allies, Britain, France, and the United States, completely gave up and even made an agreement with the Nazi Germans, so that way they would go fight the Soviet Union instead. I'm not a big fan of statements like that, especially considering that the reality of the matter is completely different. Ukraine was a totally different country in the 1990s. And let me be entirely frank. It was one of the most corrupt, poor, and despotic countries in the world at the time. It hardly had a functioning democracy. It's arguable if it even was a democracy at that point. And the fact that that kind of a country had around 11 to 1,200 nuclear weapons under its control that could have ended up on black markets, could have ended up being sold by corrupt military officials, corrupt government officials, was something that was a major concern not just to the United States or West, it was a major concern even to the also equally bad positioned Russian Federation that had just come out of the Soviet Union. Even the People's Republic of China at the time found it concerning. Everyone found it concerning that a country in that kind of state would have over 1,000 nuclear weapons that no one would really be able to account for, and no one would know what would happen to them. I would say that in that kind of a situation, it would only make sense for the countries of the world, especially Britain, America, and Russia, considering that they are they are the 3 largest nuclear powers at the time, to come forward and say, hey, you need to give those up because you, 1, are not allowed to have any by treaty, and 2, you're a very poor country that's not that well off economically, and on top of that, we don't know what's going to happen to these nuclear weapons because we can't trust anyone in your government right now to just keep them. They might sell them for money. You know, kind of like how the Chinese officers sold rocket fuel for money and then filled the missiles with water, or how the Russian Federation is constantly always scalping their own military to get a little bit of money. That's just how it was at the time. It was a completely different Ukraine. It's not the Ukraine we know today. And so that was the only thing we could do. Otherwise, because a lot of people were like, they should have kept them. Well, they would have never kept them. Most of them would have probably ended up getting sold off to terrorist groups, to who knows what, doing who knows where. I mean, you have to remember that Ukraine, the only reason China has an aircraft carrier or had an aircraft carrier is because Ukraine sold one to China. Like, China didn't get it out of nowhere. Ukraine sold one of the almost completed aircraft carriers in Ukraine to China. That's where China got its first aircraft carrier from in history. So you got to keep that in mind. Where in the world would these nuclear weapons would have gone? Most of them wouldn't have stayed in Ukraine. Most, if not all of them, would have left. And where would they have gone? Who knows? Who's to say that groups like the Taliban wouldn't have ended up in control of some kind of a nuclear weapon? Or Iran, for that matter? Or, say, any other country in the world? They weren't even Western aligned at that point. They were Russian aligned. And going off of that, they would have looked at these countries, and a lot of people would be like, there's no way Ukraine would team up with the bad guys. No, at the time, they were kind of almost with the bad guys. They had just come out of a country, the Soviet Union, that supported the bad guys. And at the time, the Ukrainian government was far more Russian aligned than it was Western aligned, by no doubt. So they would have most likely have sold those nuclear weapons to anyone who would have bought them, so that way they could have tried to make money. And so going off of that, I would say it was a great thing that we did that, you know, especially considering the realistic reality of what would have happened as a result of letting them keep their nukes. That is a far better thing that we got them to get rid of them. We didn't do anything to betray them, and of course, no one would have ever thought that one of the signing parties of the memorandum, Russia, would have ended up invading Ukraine, where all of the signing parties were at odds with each other. No one thought that would happen, and so, you know, like, I don't think we betrayed them in any step of the way. And on top of that, we have constantly been there as best as we can, given the situation at hand, supporting Ukraine and helping them. It's not like we can wave a magic wand and invade Russia and completely decapitate their government as the United States. It's not like the nuclear weapons go away because of the memorandum. We have to deal with the cards we're handed, and these are the cards we're handed, and we're playing them as best we can. I feel like it's a really unfair statement to say that we betrayed them, because if we betrayed them, then what are we doing supporting them right now? We ought to be the bad guys all the way and just let them fight the Russians on their own.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. That's kind of what I said as well. I'll give him slack though, because you know he has been under a lot of pressure throughout the war. I think he doesn't really mean it maliciously. I don't think he's probably just saying it more out of frustration because the aid has gotten there a little bit late. It's obviously not fair to say we've betrayed them, as we haven't. But you know he's been under a lot of pressure, and maybe that's why he feels inclined to say that, because he's kind of stressed out and also concerned that you know they are taking some losses here and there. But yeah, he really should watch the statements like that, because those statements right there can be rub some Americans and also Westerners the wrong way. And considering a ton of tax dollars have gone to Ukraine, it feels like a slap in the face a little bit. But at the same time, we'll give some slack because you know it is what it is.
Oh yeah, I completely understand the frustration side of things, but like just being completely unfiltered and honest about this, and about a statement like that, that's how some people could look at it. And I'll be honest, I'm not a fan of statements like that. Like I get that they're under pressure and they're in a war and that they want to lash out at people, but lashing out at the hand that feeds you just isn't a good move. It's insulting, especially to the people who don't have to help you. Like I just want to make this clear. America does not have no country in the world actually has a necessary duty where it's a part of the non-discretionary funding in our budget to give Ukraine money. We do not have to do that. We do it because we want to support them, because they are a Western-aligned country that share similar interests, and there are benefits for everyone involved if Ukraine continues to survive and win this war. But the United States does not have to support Ukraine. And I believe it's very important for the Ukrainian government to always keep that in mind and always be grateful of U.S. support, because it's not like we could have stopped the Russians from starting this war anyways. Like, to be entirely honest, this war would have happened, whether under any circumstances. It's not like we can go to war with Russia. What will that create? That creates a nuclear holocaust. Ukraine will lose that conflict. We're trying to go down the best available route. And that would be my take on that. I don't really like the comments. They're a little insulting. I get it though, and of course we'll let it slide. I'll let it slide personally, because I still see a lot of inherent interest. It doesn't matter what they say. What Zelensky says, there's still a lot of inherent interest, strategic interest for the West in supporting Ukraine. There's a lot of Ukrainian interest in this as well. But I always want to make sure that everyone should remember, words mean things. It's best not to insult the people who you literally just said months ago were the only reason that Ukraine has survived this long. And so with that, I hope that does address that the best I can. And also I see some people in the chat, let's see, betrayal for 8 months, for sure. Not really. I mean, because the thing is with Ukrainian support, and I see what you're talking about with the lack of U.S. support for a while there, the thing is that we don't, like this is something, I'm all pro-Ukraine, all pro-Western, but the reality is that the United States doesn't owe Ukraine anything. They are not a treaty partner. They're not a part of NATO. They're not a part of any economic trade union that we're in. They're not a part of a defensive pact. They're nothing. Like we have really no binding agreements with them except for the Budapest Memorandum, and a memorandum is a very, very loose agreement. It's not even binding. And so going off of that, we have no diplomatic or foreign policy responsibility to Ukraine on a legal level through the treaties that we have with other countries, and then we just don't have one. We're doing this because we want to. We are doing this because it's the right thing. It's not because we're obligated to. It's not because we're forced to. We're doing it because we want to. And that's what makes it kind of a little aggravating when Ukraine makes a statement like that. It makes it sound like we're almost forced to do this, like we have to help them, and we do not. The United States is not in a position where the whole entire world would collapse if Ukraine was lost. If Ukraine was lost, it would be incredibly precarious for the situation in Eastern Europe, but things would go on. And so that's what I got to say. And of course it's a hard thing to negotiate. And I know a lot of people are going to go, what do you mean we have no responsibility to them? That's this channel is built around supporting them and helping them out. And it is. But at the same time, you have to understand there is no binding framework beyond a memorandum, which is not binding, to help them. We help them because we want to. And I think it's a great thing, just like the Sunday night fundraiser. Y'all don't have to help Ukraine, just like America doesn't. Y'all do it because y'all want to. And it's very important for people around the world to understand that and appreciate that. Just like y'all give support to these fundraisers for these nonprofits to help out in Ukraine, the United States gives its support to Ukraine because we want to help them, not because we have to. And so with that, I hope that does address that the best I can, at least in my opinion, because I think it's a lot better a position for us to help them as friends than to do it because we owe them something. Because I feel like a passion of love is more better than a requirement of a binding contract or an agreement. So I like to look at it as we help them because we like them and we want them to succeed and win because we just like Ukraine, not because we're forced to. And so with that, I hope that does address that the best I can. Maybe a hot take, maybe not. But with that, Matthew, do you have anything to add?
I have nothing else to add. I saw someone get super upset though a second ago about what you just said there. They said something like, "I disagree with you, Enforcer." I was like, "Oh, look," I responded in the chat. I said, "I'm curious why, if you don't mind." Then he responded back and said, "You're a pompous asshole. That's why." I was like, "Oh my god!" I thought they were going to be like civil and like say something in return. I was like, I was actually going to hear them out, but they just went berserk like crazy. But anyways, they now left. So with that, we're now moving on from that into our live chat segment because no super chats tonight. We are now moving into our Morse code decoders of the stream. And tonight we have Cliff Simonson, Mark Hodges, Earl Bernew, Paul Schultz, Kevin J, Rumpelstiltskin, David Millsaps, and also Toxic Bananas. They said the LSA Signal Corps reports that tonight's Morse dispatch is Russia is getting into a pretty tough spot at the moment, trying to hold nearby Vovchansk, and long live the LSA.
And that is the sound of money, and y'all got that down on the nail. Y'all hit the jackpot. And I gotta congratulate y'all for hitting that jackpot because y'all done that for 830 days of the war, and it's impressive to see that y'all continue to get that Morse code message dead on the nail. And so with that, I hope that does address that well. Thank you so much once again for getting that Morse code message correct. And with that, we are on to the next one.
All right. And our next one here goes to Today, who says, "Do you think that Putin will use nukes?"
No. It's honestly highly unlikely that he will. We've always had that position throughout the war. It has served us incredibly well to have that position. While others have hyped up the nuclear train, we usually downplay it. Tonight is a little bit of an exception, though, because the whole Belarusian thing is a big escalation. But even then, the use of nuclear weapons is marginal, if not non-existent. It's just that Belarus now has nuclear weapons and admitted that officially today. But with that, I hope that does address that well, and we are on to the next one.
And our next question is going to go to Rainer Slava Ukraine, who says, "Is it true that they sent Magyar into Kharkiv Oblast?" That's my question.
Yes, and that is your question. They did move Magyar's birds from the area around Ivanivka on the Dnipro River, and now he's somewhere, from what we know, either in between Lipsy or Vilcha. Somewhere in there. We just know that the Magyar's birds is operating across the whole entire front in this area, and that's about all we know right now. And so, with that, I hope that does address that the best I can, at least in my opinion. And with that, well, not in my opinion, it's actual fact. He has been moved into that area. And with that, we are on to the next one.
All right. And our next one is going to go to, let's see. This one is going to go to Will Callahan. He has an interesting question about the lifespan of a Ruski. He says, "I wonder what the life expectancy is for a Russian soldier. Is it about 3 weeks or so?"
Good question. I actually would not know. I think it varies greatly from front to front. For example, on the Zaporizhia front, I think you can have a really long life down there. I think there's actually a decent amount of Russians that have survived down there since the since the end of the summer offensive of 2023. But in other areas like Avdiivka, I feel like the survival rate is probably a few weeks, maybe a month or two at best. It really just depends on each front line. But I hope that gives at least an okay approximate for the Avdiivka and southern front areas. But I wouldn't really be able to give an exact breakdown because we don't have those kinds of stats at the moment, at least. We'll probably get those after the war to be able to give an idea of Russian infantry life expectancy numbers. But I hope that's kind of like a good ballpark, though. And with that, I hope that does address that fairly well. And we are on to the next one.
And our next question goes to Andrea Fed, who says Lukashenko would would Lukashenko use nuclear weapons on insurgents to stop a coup? And wouldn't that be massive overkill? Yes, that would be massive overkill indeed. Lukashenko would say, "Oh, there's a coup happening here in the government. Rob a few nukes, just let them loose." That would be crazy.
Dude, he would have that stupid dog. Like that goofy looking puffball dog.
I vote for Fluffy.
Dude, he would... Ellen Tanuk, he would kill him. Like, I think it would be massive overkill. But the thing is that would he do it? Like it's not about him actually doing it. It's about the implication of him doing it. That's what the nuclear weapons are about. It's not about actually following through and nuking insurgents or a failed coup turned civil war. It's just about the fear. What if we conducted a coup, we failed, and then this crazy guy starts nuking us? Like, what would happen if that happened? That's kind of the fear that would be in place. I don't think he would do it though, and I think it'd be massive overkill, yes. but it still just lays out that there is the possibility of something like that happening. Kind of like how in the Cold War, the possibility of complete nuclear annihilation stopped both major powers, the Soviet Union and the United States, from entering any kind of a direct conflict. It's kind of the same thing. It's the fear of the implication that the other side could use such a weapon of mass destruction that completely avoids the conflict in the first place. Actually, funnily enough, that's the exact kind of premise that China uses. And also another thing about that, according to Army intelligence, which Matthew doesn't really think is that good, but I swear by Army intelligence because it saved my ass at the beginning of this war on war analysis, is that an interesting thing, Matthew, is that I told you this today, and I know I told you this, is that deception is the primary stratagem, because they actually don't use doctrines in China. They call them stratagems and also offensive and defensive thought. Everything in China is a certain kind of thought. They have like Maoist thought, Xi Jinping thought, defensive thought, offensive thought. Like it's a really weird thing how they say it. It's like 1984 with a thought crime crap. But anyways, one of the big things for them as a stratagem is deception and how people perceive the Chinese. And it may actually have worked a little bit, Matthew, because while the Chinese, because I had to make sure to cross-reference my book, the direct quote from Xi Jinping at the 5th plenum of the 19th Communist Congress, or the Chinese Communist Congress, from 2020, Xi Jinping said that the Chinese were entering a new era, an era where they would face the challenges to become a prosperous socialist society. And I had to make sure to like double check that. So he is saying in that book that they are planning on being capable of matching the United States by 2049 and meeting those challenges to be able to get there in between 2020 and 2049. But at the same time, the big thing about the Chinese that is mentioned in the book is that they work social media a lot to make sure to bend the public perception of the Chinese, really deceive most of the world into believing that they're a lot more powerful than they are. Kind of like how the Russians did at the before the war in Ukraine, and then that fell flat on its face when the actual results came out and they did terribly. So maybe
honestly, I think the opposite. Honestly, me personally, from what I've noticed and what I've seen and studied in political science about China, is, in my opinion, and this is not the, I don't think this is the opinion of the majority of people, but to me, it seems like China is trying to keep themselves perceptibly small. They're trying to make themselves look like they're not really a threat. That's what they've been doing for a very long time. So that way they can try to get economically tied up with the West and the United States to create such an intertwining that it's super difficult to detach from them. And once they create that scenario, like they have at this point, then they start acting up with Taiwan and start acting up with these other places. And then, like we see today, we're in a catch-22 with China. And at the same time, they're trying to make themselves seem like they're really not that much of a threat with their military. So they don't really play it up too much. They hold their military parades and things like that, which they obviously put their military power on display. But they're not going out of their way to make it seem like, oh, we're big bad China, watch out for us. But the power is there. Like, make no mistake, the power is lying under the surface. It just simply hasn't been shown yet. I'm not saying that they're an almighty force or anything like that. I'm not trying to go overboard. But they are a powerhouse to be dealt with.
Now, really quickly, because we're about to get into another discussion here, like an argument, whatever people want to call it. I just want to put this out there, folks. When we have discussions like this on stream, it is not at all hostile. We're not getting on bad terms with each other or getting each other angry. We're just talking stuff out. And so do not take it that way, because I saw the last time we were talking about this on stream tonight, everyone was like, oh my God, they're going to blows. No, we're not. We're just talking. Sometimes it'll sound a little bit like we're getting a little bit tense with our tones, but it means nothing. We just talk like that here in this house. But anyways, moving on from that, I would have to say I disagree with you a little bit. That's why I had to preface that with that statement. I'd have to disagree because the Chinese do play up themselves a good bit, at least within their region. Like, for example, messing with the Philippines. Like, we see that every day now, where they go down there with Chinese Coast Guard vessels, and they are harassing the Navy of the Philippines, or Filipino tender vessels, or Filipino fishermen, trying to make sure that they exert their influence over the South China Sea and the Spratly and Paracel Island areas, which the Chinese claim. They do the exact same thing with Taiwan, constantly making sure that they look to be a massive threat that could kick off a war any day with Taiwan. And they also do the exact same thing with Japan, interestingly enough. They actually end up claiming, I forgot what it is. It's like Sapako Island or something like it's somewhere down here in the East China Sea, I believe. But they claim it, and they say that they actually control that island, and they actually send naval warships into those waters to tell Japanese fishermen to leave, and also to get into standoffs with the Japanese Navy in that area. Then not only that, they also, like we just saw last week, they make open threats, the Minister of Defense does, saying that the United States better not get involved or suffer the consequences. And so while they may have been that unassuming, not really dangerous power in the 1970s to 2000, well, like 2000, the year 2000, that's because they weren't trying to power project or turn into this prosperous nation or have that national rejuvenation that Xi Jinping has brought about after he became the premier of China. Now Xi Jinping is moving them down this new path of actually being a kind of a power of its own, and maybe even a threat to other spheres in the world. And it really looks to me like, at least within their scope, their very regional scope, they are trying to make themselves look more of a threat than they ever have in the past.
Maybe so, maybe so. But honestly, I think I actually agree with you somewhat. I think you agree with me as well. Because basically what I'm saying is China kept themselves, with their military projection. This is what I'm referring to. They kept themselves small in the projection sense of their power, so that way they could become very good friends economically with the West and the United States to get really intertwined. And now, like you're saying, China is starting to project their power in less of a soft way and more of a hard projection of power in the modern day, with Taiwan, also in the Philippines. Not really so much with Japan, a little bit here and there, but more so down there in the South China Sea area. That's what they're doing now, because they've sort of switched to a new strategy, like you'd mentioned. But in the past, they kept themselves small until they finally grew their power so large. Now they're in a position where they can actually cause some damage and really not have too many repercussions come their way, because they built their military up and they built everything else up to follow it.
And I mean, that's a point, but I don't think them staying small, because the Chinese military has actually been, I think, about 1 million in size, really since the end of the Civil War. It's always been an incredibly large military at all times.
When I say small, like keep them so small, I mean like the perception of their military, not the actual size of it, just the perception overall. Like they're not really focused on their military power, but it's there, but that's not their main focus. That's how they try to make themselves perceived as in the past.
Maybe so. I mean, well, the Soviets didn't think they were small, man. They were scared of them. They were about to nuke them in the 70s. That's why Nixon went to China, was because we were going to become friends with the Chinese, because they were getting in a standoff with the Soviets. And the Soviets considered them to be concerning enough they would get in a standoff with them. But I don't know. I mean, maybe, but I don't really think that they were trying to downplay the perception back then or make themselves seem small. They just were. I mean, their economy was incredibly small. The way their military was organized was really weird. Like, even the official army was more of a militia through most of their history up until about the late 90s. Well, really the early 90s more so. But it was really a militia all the way up until very recent history, and was poorly organized and poorly formed. Like, something that might be shocking, Matthew, that you don't know, is that when Mao was still the chairman, when they went to war with Vietnam in 1979, they actually had a rankless army. Like, everyone in the army was the same rank and got the same pay. There was no generals or no sergeants or officers. Everyone was the same rank, and it ended up doing poorly. Like obviously, it ended up doing incredibly poorly, and they ended up taking incredibly high losses in the Sino-Vietnamese War, and they ended up getting completely indecisive results, although losing, I think, tens of thousands dead in that war. So
Mao Zedong did a number on the Chinese people. Like, he really did. Like, that guy was a brutal guy, super brutal. Honestly, in my opinion, I think Mao Zedong thought, that's what you want to call it, like that line of thinking from that era. Maoist thought, that's probably a better term. That's probably still the most prevalent form of thinking in China. I know that Xi Jinping is trying to bring it into this new age China type of thinking. Yeah. Xi Jinping thought he better come up with a better word than that to catch on. Yeah. But he's trying to bring it into that. But I think Maoism is still what's prevalent in China. It seems to be what the traditional sense has always been in that country, and it's sort of still that way, from what I can tell, in the majority of the minds of the people.
It really is, especially in the military, because the People's Liberation Army, which I'm just going to call the PLA because that's a lot shorter. The PLA actually emphasizes Marxist-Leninist thought and Maoist thought. And then as far as their stratagems and offensive and defensive thought goes, or their execution of active defense, which is what they call their military strategy, they generally emphasize Sun Tzu's Art of War and Mao's People's War concepts. So really, Mao is still the most influential person as far as his ideology in China goes, but Xi Jinping is really starting to move to try and replace it a little bit, because Maoist thought is just not compatible with the direction China's going in. You know, Maoist thought was very, very hardcore socialist. It wasn't Marxist per se, but it was very hardcore socialist in its tenets. It encouraged a high level of nationalism, which the Chinese still want, but at the same time, the People's War concept is extremely bizarre, because it's pretty much a literal concept of just every single war is endless human waves. There's no actual major strategy or really a lot of organization of any kind of command structure or anything like that. It's just ridiculousness. I mean, every single war that China ever fought, like the Korean War even, they took incredibly high losses because it was that People's War mindset. That's just ridiculous. It's like a toddler's version of fighting a war. And so Xi Jinping is bringing about a modernized idea, and actually they call it informatization, something like that. It's informationization. There we go. Informationization. That is so hard to say. Like, it's so freaking hard, man. But Xi Jinping calls it informatization, something like that. And that's what they're doing right now. And he also is trying to eventually, and this is actually something he said in the plenum of the 19th Congress, the 5th one. He said that he wants to move China to being a prosperous socialist society, and specifically laid out that they pretty much want China, the nation, the communist Chinese, to be the United States with an extremely large and prosperous middle class by 2049. And that's the plan. And everything else around that.
Oh, wait a minute. You said a middle class?
Yeah, an extremely prosperous and massive middle class.
China confuses the hell out of
I
me.
know,
what
right?
they're trying to do with their economy. What the, like, China is like this weird, odd mix. They're obviously not completely communist because they have a little bit of capitalism sprinkled in here and there. They like to have like the advantages of capitalism, but the control of communism. And it's like they're trying to create the middle class. It's like, well, that's not really a communist idea. That the classes, like, that messes up communism completely. I don't really know what China's trying to be. That not knowing their identity might be the doom of the country, like in the end.
Well, you know what's even crazier, Matthew, is that they have a right, like even right now, because right now China honestly is literally an industrial nation at this point, because they have the what the U.S. Army called in the book the ultra hyper upper class. You know, like the guy who's the CEO of Alibaba, you know, in Temu and all those guys. You have the ultra super hyper upper class, and then you just have the low class, and then you have a small middle class right now inside of China. But they want to move everyone from the lower class up into the middle class. But that means that in the end, China is not going to be an industrial nation like they have been up till now. They're going to end up being just like America, with a mostly service-based economy. And so that is going to be really weird to see a China like that. But that's the plan that they're going for. And everything else is just an extenuation of trying to make that happen. The whole sphere building thing, because the United States, it doesn't have a massive middle class just because we're good at the economy. We have this huge sphere of influence that kind of just bolsters the United States in that position. That's why we trade with everyone in the world. That's why we're the world police. To get this kind of a massive, prosperous middle class, you have to have a huge sphere of influence to support it. And so that's why China is trying to do One Belt, One Road program, and they're also trying to massively expand their armed forces to be able to secure and protect this massive sphere they plan on building, so that way they can have the same kind of benefits or hopes or really aspirations that the United States had at the end of World War II. So really, really bizarre thing. And also, right now, from what the Army says, the mechanized units of the Chinese Army are very, very similar to the U.S. Army's unit structures in World War II, which seem kind of dated, but actually they're not that far behind what we use in modern day. But anyways, with that, we've got to get to some questions. We have rabbit holed so much on the Chinese tonight. It's been almost like a China-Ukraine war news show. But with that, we are going to get as many live chats as we can. And so with that, we are on to the next one.
And this one is going to go to East, who says, do you think U.S. weapons will be used to strike inside of Russia?
Yes, they will be. HIMARS have already been used to strike in Russia, but the ATACMS is still yet to be seen. And so with that, I hope that does address that well. And we are on to the next one.
And this one goes to Loopy, who says, do you think that tanks are rapidly becoming ineffective in the modern world of warfare?
I think tanks in their, well, not in their classic form, but tanks in their contemporary form are becoming dated, and they're going to have to require new active protection systems to ensure that the tank remains a viable weapon on the battlefield. It's not really a question of if it's become dated, it's more so a question of what needs to be improved, and I think that active protection systems are most likely going to become a standard or a norm on main battle tanks of the future. And so with that, I hope that does address that well, and we are on to the next one.
All right, and our next one is going to go to Lucas Kraft, who said, what happened with the situation about the Chinese military being too corrupt to do any operations?
The Chinese military being too corrupt? Is that what they asked?
Yes, to do any operations, that is.
No, they're not that corrupt. Because while I was saying earlier that there are some massive shortcomings in the Chinese military, like the lack of JTACs, that doesn't mean that they are a completely ineffective army. The United States does consider them, even at the moment, to be a serious regional threat, and they do say that they are the largest regional air power in the area, and if a conflict was to break out, they would almost constantly overpower the United States in the air. That's something that the United States Army actually admitted in the book, because there would be no way for us to power project an equal number of aircraft into the area. There's just no way, and we could go into that in detail, but that would require me to like go down another 30-minute rabbit hole, and I'm trying to make this a little bit more concise. But beyond that, the Chinese have gone through massive reforms over the past really 10 years, much like Ukraine did before the invasion of Ukraine. The Chinese military has gone through major reforms, both in its organizational structure and also with its military districts. Instead of having 7 military districts, they now have 5 theater commands, and each one has a specialized mission compared to the other ones. The one that actually deals with the West the most, including Japan and Taiwan, is actually the Eastern Theater Command, which is headquartered in Nanjing, formerly called Nanking back in World War II times. But beyond that, they have 3 group armies inside of this area. They also have a large amount of naval assets to call on. No aircraft carrier, though. The aircraft carriers are only in the Southern Theater Command down here, and also in the, I believe, the Eastern Theater Command. Well, actually, no, sorry, correction. Northern Theater Command, which is right up here in Shandong, and also controls Manchuria and Inner Mongolia. So, going off of that, I would say that they're not incompetent. They've certainly been going through major reforms, but according to the Army, they still have a good bit to go to be at the level that the U.S. military is at, with the same kind of abilities or at least competency that we have due to a massive amount, really over a century now, of experience in modern warfare, while the Chinese, for about the past 50 years, have absolutely no real combat experience as an army and have been able to develop their doctrine, or as they call it, stratagems and different kinds of thought. They have not been able to develop those based off of real-life actual experience. It's all in theoretics at the moment, and not based off of anything practicable. But with that, I hope that does address that the best I can, at least in my opinion at the moment. And that can be wrong. I mean, the Chinese could be completely incompetent. And while I was saying earlier that they do have massive deficiencies, that does not mean that they are something to be joked with. That they are still a serious power in the region. And considering that we would be fighting in their region, around their territorial waters, they would pose a considerable risk, not just to the United States Navy, but also to our allies in the surrounding area. And so with that, I hope that does address that the best I can, and we are on to the next one.
All right, and the next one goes to DL, who says, can you describe how there's a difference between a nuclear delivery system versus the warhead itself, and just a very high level, so we are all on the same level?
Okay, so a nuclear delivery system is the way that the nuclear weapon makes it to its target. That can be by either missile or by aircraft. The aircraft can launch missiles, although in a nuclear form, from what I understand, at least for the United States, that would be a little rare. Usually we use B-61 gravity bombs in that sort of a situation, and they're usually dropped by a multi-role aircraft like an F-15 or an F-35. But Those are the delivery systems for a nuclear weapon. The nuclear warhead is the actual nuke. So the whole missile, like for example, an Iskander missile is nuclear capable, and it could have a nuclear weapon mounted onto it. The thing is, though, is that while it's a nuclear weapons delivery system, it does not always have a nuclear warhead on it. It can also just carry a conventional warhead, like all of them have so far in Ukraine. But with the actual nuclear warhead, that's where we start talking about kilotons, the amount of damage, the blast radius, the expected casualties, and that kind of stuff is when we talk about the warhead. And also, there's several different kinds of warheads. There are unitary warheads. Well, really, there's two major kinds. There are unitary warheads, which is a singular nuclear bomb. Really, it was just a massive bomb. Gets lobbed on something, blows up. And then there are MIRVs, which are multiple independent reentry vehicles. Those are some of the most concerning ones in the world because a singular missile can fire off anywhere in between 7 to 9 nuclear warheads at a time. Each of them can have an incredibly large yield. And those MIRVs, or the reentry vehicles, can actually hit multiple separate targets, multiple different cities. And that's something that's incredibly concerning as a nuclear weapon, because the amount of damage that could actually be inflicted over a wider area or over more targets is far grander than the singular missile with a unitary warhead. But with that, I hope that kind of explains the difference in between the delivery system and the warhead itself, and kind of gets it out there. The delivery system is how the nuclear bomb makes it to its target. The actual nuclear weapon is what blows up on what blows up on the target. And so with that, I hope that does address that well. And I think we are on to the third to last question of the night.
And this one is going to go to Gold, who says, what alternative would you two like to have in charge of Russia instead of Putin if you could choose freely? If it were me, speaking on my behalf, I would say, if I could choose freely, I would put Zelensky in charge of Russia for all the trouble he's been put through. But obviously that would never happen. That's not realistic. But seriously speaking, honestly, there's really nobody else in Russia to pick because Putin's already picked them all off. That could have been put there instead. He gets rid of those political distance pretty quick, and there's no chance of them ever rising to power or even being put into power. Let's see. Navalny, he was maybe an option. He honestly was not a preferred option, in my opinion. He kind of had some weird sentiments toward Ukraine, not really supporting Ukraine's independence, and he was kind of like against it, really, honestly. So he was an option, probably the better option that there was in Russia, but not really a good one. But he's gone now, obviously. He's been knocked off, just like the rest of them. But Enforcer, what say you?
I would say, in my opinion, I couldn't name a specific person. I would say, however, that it would be a dictator, because that's really the only kind of government that will exist in Russia. I know many people would want a democracy. I'd want a democracy, but we have to deal with the reality here. A democracy probably would not survive in Russia for long. It would be like the one we have right now. I would say that a dictatorship of some form, whether it be a hard dictatorship or a looser dictatorship with at least a little bit of input, would exist in Russia, but it would be one that would be friendly towards the West. That would be the kind of government that I would want to look for. But that would be pretty difficult to get, and that would be pretty difficult to upkeep. A democracy would be practically impossible to upkeep inside of Russia. It would devolve back into a dictatorship, a lot like the current democracy in Russia already has. And so with that, I hope that does address that the best I can. And we are on, I think, Matthew, to the final question of the night, if I'm correct?
So yes, this will be the final one of the night.
All right, and so we are on to the final question of the night. And so who was like the last person to throw in the lucky last question of the night?
And that viewer is, you're taking my life.
Oh!
It says, why does it seem like most of the major wars always occur on European soil?
Good question. That's usually because the Europeans economically are very high up there. You know, when we exclude China and the United States, Europe is the wealthiest continent in the world, like by far, if we're not talking about the US or China. And so for that reason, and especially historically they were actually the largest economies in the world. Nowadays, they've been overtaken by China and the United States, but if we were to remove the China and the United States from the picture, it was Europe, and it always has been. And that's why wars always seem to happen in Europe. That's why it always seems like the largest wars happen in Europe, because they require so much technology, so much manpower, and usually so many lives lost to make any progress in these wars, because They are the largest and really most important determining wars in the world historically. Every major war looks like it happens in Europe, because something that will shock everyone is that the Sudanese civil war ended up killing, well, actually not the Sudanese civil war, it's actually Sudanese civil war, there kind of was one that ended up creating South Sudan back in 2013. Many people don't know this, but 2 million Sudanese citizens died in that war that ended up creating South Sudan. 2 million. And it was over the course of just a few years. It wasn't that long of a civil war. I think it was like maybe 3 years long, and 2 million people died, not including the wounded. That trumps the amount of casualties that have happened in between Ukraine and Russia. But the reality is that there's not a lot of economic backing in a country like Sudan, so a massive war like that just fades into the background. It's just something that you do not hear about or talk about, because it's not something that's going to change the entire world. Now, the war in Ukraine could end up changing the entire world. It could end up affecting the balance of power in Europe. It could start to try and see the Russians reassert themselves in Eastern Europe, and that is something that is incredibly concerning, especially considering it also pertains to nuclear powers on both sides, the Russians and the United States, and the United Kingdom and France that are involved. It all, once again, makes it look like it's an incredibly major conflict, although the casualties in reality are incredibly small and are dwarfed by a war that isn't even really known, which is the Sudanese civil war that created South Sudan. But with that, I hope that kind of addresses the question well. That's about the best explanation I can give at the moment, but it's a really, really in-depth answer, even more than that, as to why it looks like major wars always happen in this area of the world in Europe. But with that, this is the end of tonight's stream. I gotta say that it's been a really fun night getting to report the news to all of y'all. And at the peak, there were 9.4 thousand people here, and 67,000 people have watched this stream before it ended. I've got to say that we are entirely honored to be able to run this stream tonight and also raise $4.5 thousand for Nova Ukraine, an amazing nonprofit helping out over there across the seas in Ukraine and helping to support the war effort. It is absolutely incredible to know that all of y'all helped out in that and made sure that we would have support to send to Nova Ukraine, to make sure that they will be able to keep on helping out the way they do. And I thank you all so much once again for being a part of that. I will see you all on Tuesday at 10 p.m. Eastern Time to cover the next 24 hours of the news of the war in Ukraine. Good night, good luck, take care, stay safe, Slava Ukraini, and long live the Lee Spring Army. Dang, that was a voice crack. Long live the Lee Spring Army. The Lee Spring Army will never die.
And good night, folks. We'll see you all on Tuesday night. And thank you all for another great stream tonight and another successful fundraiser for Nova Ukraine. Huge shout out to everybody for the generosity tonight and making it another successful one. And with that, we'll see you all on Tuesday, like I said. And of course, Slava Ukraine, Heroem Slava, get some rest and enjoy your Monday, and good night.
Yes.
The Leaf Spring Army sends its regards.
Army,